The Soul Hunters technologies created a very dual impression inside me. On the one hand, they were clearly based on an organic elemental base, as in the case of the Vorlons of the Shadows, and on the other, for some reason the obtained ship, the pilot, and the artifacts from the planet were perceived as a Neanderthal club next to an elegant sword forged by the best armor at the court of some baron. Well, something like that, yes. The hunters themselves belong to the usual meat species, no energy structures in the body, nothing supernatural in biology and metabolism. Well, except for the ability to feel the outcome of life, of creatures that are destined to die in the near future. The pilot of the captured ship, kept for some time in a small cell limited by force fields, behaved very defiantly, I would even say aggressively, promising incredible punishments from his relatives, threatening that the kidnappers will pay, and so on. But even from his face, without resorting to brain scanning, it was noticeable that the alien was very nervous, even almost in panic. The only time he twitched was when I sent one of the necks, who still lived with Alice on my planetoid, down the next corridor. The hunter literally followed the living creature with his eyes, frowning in bewilderment. He followed them, clearly having no idea that there was anyone there. They had checked him for basic telepathy when they were just delivering him from his home system to the laboratory complex. He had a telepathic gene, albeit different from those that the Vorlons put into intelligent beings. But it was so underdeveloped that the ceiling for its owner would only be insignificant empathy, and perhaps a similar transmission of his own strong emotions outward. In short, he is not a telepath. Not a telepath, but the Neku saw.
Nie magnim zła залізячення віження затеги, муженного не jest кімана і не розташу з ушлевца кінева увола, пифофриня вист, хово і дару, котре постовщенко ще здізе. Не свондраж го зашетові матбері, і криші, євен отаргажа красце в тесту буванес, дажаваче, невен омамie to jest reżenie mowiedzy, krustu wrzeszcz to dułanie szliwienie, dargażu łasłaj mie i agreżuje dużenie barzate, negłodajesz weż niektrnie, która stepsusta, i radonatnie wtranam do naukroto skrojte wteranan banier z rajrem je zogi na bardzo prostując. Nie ma nin za zalizjaczynie wierzeń zategi, murzennego unny jest kimane nie rstaszujnko się zdzieza. Nie słondraż bo zeszetowi matbri, nie strza kimona nie rstoduwanes, brisanie brozo prostując. Przempara nie rstaszujnko się zdzieza, pregolacie i w dorgażu je druku stojąc. Puje czyn, a ja na przez tym nie gad. Warawuje mak somo wierzenia otrana.
Unexpected but very curious, for the first time in my memory and in the memory of the replicators, they encountered something for which they could not immediately find an analog and explanation. However, in the case of practically limitless possibilities for theorizing, modeling and conducting inhuman various experiments, the iron spiders had simply inexhaustible potential, therefore. Having sent the hunter and his ship for a thoughtful vivisection, I simultaneously give the order to grow a similar brain with an additional organ, only connected to the replicator network. Fortunately, such technology had already been perfectly tested on the example of the neckmaids and behemoth. The soul itself, taken out by the younger one from the storage on the planet, also deserved special attention.
Having been delivered to the laboratory complex, the glowing glass ball was placed in the room shielded, just in case, in all known spectra to the replicators, and then subjected to the most thorough scanning, excluding perhaps the transport beam of the Asgards. Without knowing the nature of the object stored behind the transparent shell, it was quite possible to get a black hole at the output when trying to transform it into energy. But this could only worry me at first, while my ships were in the hunter's system. Now, that 2 hunter ships had fled their home system with their tails between their legs, nothing prevented the spider from returning to the hull and taking a few more dozens of artifacts stored there, and therefore, research. Yes, it was worth starting with the fact that the ball was not glass at all. The results of the spectral analysis showed that this sphere is a monolithic structure of an extremely strong mineral with a very complex internal structure.
What looked like a whole Christmas tree toy made of thin glass was in fact a complex conglomerate of transparent threads, intertwined at the atomic level so tightly that the final hardness of the object exceeded that of a natural diamond by 148.325%. The substance glowing inside the sphere, in addition to the quite obvious emission of photons registered by any existing methods, was not recorded by the replicator sensors in any way. It was visible, the outer surface of the sphere was warmer than the environment by 5.63 Kelvin, but it was impossible to say whether this heating was related to the fullness of the storage facility. I simply did not have an empty sphere for comparison. In any case, the issue of a more thorough study of the structure had to be closed, and therefore one of the spheres was sent to the far end of my territories, to one of the uninhabited and practically empty star systems, not interesting even from the point of view of mining.
Having assembled from the replicator modules a mobile laboratory module consisting of a teleportation device, a power source, and a bunch of all sorts of sensors, I pressed the button. And I even felt a little awkward. Because absolutely nothing happened. I mean, a thin beam from a teleporter hit the glass ball lying on the pedestal, and the information about its internal structure, energy saturation, and other parameters necessary for the Asgard device to transfer matter from place to place immediately began to flow into the replicator network. No explosion, no unusual effects whatsoever. The receptacle of the soul simply and routinely moved from place to place, without changing in any way, either externally or in the eyes of the replicator scanners. Well, the result is no worse than any other possible ones, and we won't tell anyone about the sudden surge of our own paranoia.
At the same time as the command was given to return the sample under study back to the laboratory, a notification appeared in the replicator network about the completion of the assembly of the Great Machine, version 2.0 complex. Finally. The device was completely ready and functionally repeated the system assembled in the depths of Epsilon 3, differing only in the materials used and more advanced energy sources. But then something strange began. As soon as the power from the MNT reactor was supplied to the main systems of the machine, the process of complex mathematical calculations began in the network of replicators. Calculations that, in accordance with the schemes of the device, were used by it when creating a time puncture. The great machine began to carry out calculations to open a window to an extremely remote point in the timeline, located in the distant past. And this calculation was marked with the highest priority in the hierarchy of the network.
That is, you want to say that in the original Great Machine, created by an unknown civilization in an unknown depth of time, a certain action was programmed, in case it was reproduced by replicators which simply did not exist in this universe 2 years ago. Am I the only one who sees some problem in this? No, seriously. On this basis, I almost launched a total check of the entire software stuffing of the replicator network, including my own consciousness, which Corone very strongly and persistently wanted. Himself, voluntarily. Only here, experiencing an indescribable range of emotions from the guess that had arisen. First of all, I launched an additional check of that part of the Great Machine structure that was responsible for maintaining the Zatras population and, as I already knew, contained elements in its composition that were extremely similar to the technologies known to replicators, residual tachyon background,
Discrepancies in the architecture of the overall design and individual modules. Unauthorized behavior of the second great machine. Yeah. Well, what the hell? Behemoth, who had been dozing on the sofa until now, raised his head in surprise, reacting to the booming metallic sound that echoed throughout my cabin at the station. The sound of my own forehead hitting the tabletop. Interlude. Captain. Ivanova shook her head, watching Sheridan as he paced from side to side. Because of you, it's beginning to seem to me that there's some kind of malfunction in the Babylon 5 ventilation system. You raised the wind. The officer stood in front of one of the station's customs terminals, awaiting the arrival of yet another distinguished guest, whose arrival, as seemed to be becoming a tradition, was reported to John by a short notice over a close channel that came straight to the captain's terminal.
And now the captain was expressing his irritation with the whole situation by all available methods. For example, by pacing from side to side, muttering something inarticulate under his breath. What? Ugh. The man grimaced, still stopping and turning to his deputy. Lieutenant, your jokes. Such is the situation. Such are the jokes. The woman shrugged. Sir, it's just a nightmare. Every day another high-ranking bigwig from Earth drops in on us, and they don't even bother to explain what they need here anyway. I'm sick of it. What about the secrets, the intrigues, the surprises? The woman raised an eyebrow. Is this how you try to cheer me up? I didn't even think about it, sir. Ivanova shook her head, glancing sideways at her boss. Okay,
John nodded his head slowly. Otherwise, I'll get completely soft. In that case, a slow and painful death awaits us all. Ivanova smiled, pleased that she had managed to distract the captain from his tense thoughts.
The woman was clearly about to say something else, but at that moment the terminal doors finally opened and the first passengers of the newly arrived transport ship began to enter the station. Captain Sheridan, the man who approached, extended his hand for a handshake. Commander Ivanova, he greeted the woman as well. My name is David Endawi, military intelligence. I apologize for dropping in on you out of the blue. He spread his arms, smiling slightly apologetically. But the boss sends you on a business trip and you're just following orders? A familiar situation, sir, Ivanova chuckled. Can we talk without witnesses? David became serious, looking questioningly at the captain. Of course, John nodded. Please, let's go. Yes, it would be very good if we could invite the Minbari ambassador Delaine to our conversation. Ambassador Delaine, the commander raised her eyebrows in surprise. I'll ask her to come. I don't think she'll refuse. You'll be very obliging, the scout nodded, following the captain down the corridor. And Sheridan himself walked ahead, his face becoming even more thoughtful. Military intelligence. What the hell could they need here, especially so soon after Frederick Lenz? The only thing that came to mind was that ill-fated report on the Calvados's flight, in which the frigate collided with a ship of shadows, as Sheridan now knew. On the one hand, it was good that Earth had at least somehow reacted to the sent document. So much time had passed that he, sinfully, began to wonder if the piece of paper had been lost in the endless bureaucratic routes of the command. But on the other, remembering the slips of the tongue and hints of that same Lenz, John was already seriously doubting whether it was worth rejoicing at the high command from the homeland too much. There was a bad smell from foreign policy in the current situation.
Earth too obviously wanted to sweeten up to the Centaurians, not even wanting to understand the real background of the events taking place.
I'll leave you for a moment. Ivanova nodded her head towards the turn of the corridor. I invite Ambassador Delaine to our meeting. Of course, Commander. We'll wait for you, Sheridan nodded. The man walked in almost complete silence to the separate small conference room, located in the immediate vicinity of the captain's office of Babylon 5, and usually used by Sheridan for holding meetings with officers.
Endawi looked around with curiosity, occasionally asking meaningless questions. The man clearly did not intend to conduct any important conversations in public places, behaving in full accordance with his profession and the declared desire to talk without witnesses. While we wait for Commander Ivanova and Ambassador Delaine, the captain sighed, letting David into the hall. Perhaps you have something directly for my ears. It's hard to say, Captain, the scout shrugged. I wasn't lying when I said that I was sent on a mission to the Babylon somewhat suddenly. Like you, I know no more than what the leadership thinks I should know. He spread his hands. I can only say that my visit was prompted by your report sent to headquarters. About the incident with Calvados? Exactly, Captain. The people in charge took a long time to digest all this, the man winced. But were finally forced to admit that this case, at the very least, requires additional investigation.
And speaking of which, will I be able to speak to your first assistant? Lieutenant Prendick, as far as I remember? That's right, Sheridan nodded. I don't see any obstacles, but I would like to be present at the conversation as the senior officer of the ship. Oh, no problem, Captain Sheridan. Endawi waved his hand. You certainly have the right to do so, and I have no intention of disputing it. Besides, I just wanted to get information firsthand. Perhaps he can fill in some details. Captain Sheridan? Delaine, accompanied by Ivanova, entered the room with some surprise in her voice.
You wanted to see me? Ah, Mr.
Good afternoon, Ambassador. The man nodded. My name is David Endawi. I apologize for the surprise, but it was I who asked to invite you to this meeting. I am here on a matter of utmost importance and on behalf of my government.
I don't quite understand what you're talking about, Mr. Endawi. The Minbari bowed, casting a quick glance at John and catching the captain's barely noticeable nod. But I think it's really quite important. I'm listening to you. I will address the same question to the other ambassadors, including the League. David went to the terminal on the wall, but I was hoping to talk to you first. After all, we have friendly relations with your people, and Minbar, being an ancient civilization, may know about the subject of this conversation. I'll do everything in my power to help, Delenn nodded, sitting down on one of the chairs. Some time ago, David took out an information crystal, inserting it into the socket on the terminal. Captain Sheridan informed us that his ship, the frigate Calvados, during one of its routine raids to clear the sectors adjacent to Babylon 5 of pirate gangs, was forced to engage in combat with a previously unknown enemy. Mr.
Endo pressed a button on his terminal and launched a video feed that John recognized as one of the files attached to his report, recorded by the Calvados's cameras. The footage showed the middle of the battle, just as the shadow ship flew right in front of the frigate, then delivered a powerful blow that made the picture shudder. From the stony expression on Delenn's face, Sheridan realized that the woman was frantically trying to figure out what could, and most importantly should, be answered to a question that had not yet been asked, but was absolutely obvious. Lieutenant Prendick was forced into combat, the captain sighed. The man winced. The tragic incident with your people's ship. I understand, Captain, Delenn nodded.
Our specialists, David continued, have carefully studied all the records provided by the captain. It is difficult to accurately estimate the size of an unfamiliar object in space or hyperspace, but this ship is clearly very large, and it has serious firepower. I read the reports from the station's service departments after repairing the damage to the Calvados hull. This is a serious force. Moreover, a force that is completely unfamiliar to us, and one that has already shown its aggression. Since the issue may become very serious, I must gather all possible information, learn everything I can about this ship. The Minbari, slightly embarrassed by the scout's pressure, shook her head, looking away from the terminal display. I'm very sorry, Mr. Endawi. I would be very happy to help you, but I've never seen a ship like this before, and its appearance is as unexpected as it was for your people, and just as disturbing.
Well, David sighed. It would be naive of me to expect to get an answer right away just by asking the question. Captain, the man turned to John. None of the other ships that arrived at Babylon 5 or your fighter pilots reported anything similar?
No, Sheridan shook his head. And I think that if they had met such a ship somewhere far from the station, there would have been no one to tell about such a meeting. That's reasonable. Captain, Lieutenant, could you put me up for quarters? I'll need a few days to talk to as many ambassadors as I can. Everything is ready. Ivanova nodded. I can take you there right now. In that case, I will not say goodbye, Captain. He nodded to the man. Ambassador Delenn, thank you for the conversation. Good luck in your search, Mr. Endawi. The Minbari rose from her chair, bowing.
With a curt nod, the intelligence officer took the data crystal from the terminal's socket and followed Ivanova out of the conference room. And Delenn, waiting for the door to close behind them, turned to John, giving vent to her emotions. The fact that your ship survived its encounter with the shadows is an incredible miracle. But, the ambassador frowned, shaking her head. The fact that others, your government, have learned about them now. I remember your story with Ambassador Kosh, the man sighed. But the situation is more complicated than it seems. Calvados encountered the shadows before that story with Mr. Morden, when I simply did not yet know who they were and what their return would threaten. Besides, I have obligations to my state. The fight for the cause of light is undoubtedly important, but too many people saw the damage to the frigate. They could not have been kept silent in any case. And so, he waved his hand. Mr. Endawi's visit only illustrates that no one understands anything and does not really know. I do hope you're right, Captain. Delenn sighed heavily. The cost of a mistake. If the shadows realize we're preparing for a confrontation, the cost of that mistake would be too great. I'll try to make sure it doesn't come to that. But, Delenn, yes? I thought the Minbari didn't lie. The captain chuckled, trying to defuse the situation. And I didn't lie. The woman smiled with the corners of her lips. Descriptions of the times of the last war, of course, are available in Minbar, and his appearance here and now, she looked into the eyes of John the Minbark, is very,
very unexpected and alarming. But she emphasized the word with her voice, have not seen the ships until now. Oh, this is not good, not good. Zatras shook his head.
Dressed in a rough fur vest over a nondescript, shabby worksuit, the wild-looking humanoid stood in the middle of one of the many corridors of the complex, looking ahead with a wary expression on his face, listening to the monotonous but gradually increasing hum coming from the depths of the great machine. Something was happening in the complex, but Zatras couldn't figure out what. The sensor readings he saw while passing the control terminals were alarming and strange. The great machine's systems were experiencing numerous glitches and deviations that did not indicate anything good. But at the same time, the machine was working, clearly doing something. Although Zatras didn't remember Dral starting any of the processes, especially in the temporal core. We need to warn someone, Zatras said slowly, staring at another screen and reading the running lines of numbers. But no one will listen to Zatras. They never listen. Sighing, Zatras shook his shaggy head, sucked his teeth and hobbled towards the nearest service elevator before heading to Dral. It was worth finding out what was going on. The operator of the great machine was probably busy, exploring the abysses of space with his mind. Zatras couldn't blame him, but at times like these it would be nice if the one responsible for everything around him was not out there, but at his workplace. Preferably not only in body. But if Zatras found out what was happening to the machine, what affected its systems? Zatras, they called out to him from the darkness from around the corner of the corridor a second. Exactly the same humanoid appeared in exactly the same fur vest. The machine's temporal core is picking up interference. This is bad. That's bad, Zatras, the man echoed, nodding sadly. That's bad. Zatras knows and is on his way to check the lower levels of the machine.
It would be bad if we woke Dral before we figured it out ourselves. Dral would scold Zatras again. Nobody listens to Zatras.
Zatras shook his head.
Nobody ever listens to Zatras. Zatras raised his finger instructively. Entering the narrow booth, Zatras pressed the lowest button on the metal panel, his brow furrowed in thought. The machine's temporal core had picked up interference. This was strange. The core was responsible for time travel, helped the great machine open windows in time, but what could have created interference in the universe? A galactic-level cataclysm affecting the foundations of the universe? No. Baring his jagged teeth, Zatras shook his head. Not that. The great machine kept records of many cataclysms, of exploding stars, of merging entire galaxies, so monstrous in their consequences that Zatras was terrified by the mere thought that such a thing could happen somewhere else right now. But none of them affected time.
Zatras remembers something. The humanoid pressed his fingers to his chin, frowned but shook his head in disappointment. But he forgot what exactly. Bad. Very bad. Zatras forgot. And that was probably important. The elevator shuddered slightly as it stopped, and Zatras shook his head and stepped forward from the cabin, taking off his vest as he went. The lower levels of the great machine were hot. The giant thermonuclear reactors working non-stop simply couldn't help but emit a large amount of heat, so much so that even the perfect cooling system installed by the creators of this place couldn't remove it completely. But only here, practically in the core of Epsilon 3, could one reach the temporal core. The complex device was very important. It controlled time. It could open and close time windows and maintain the stability of the timeline around the machine after that.
Zatras walked down a long corridor, through a series of doors that opened before him, and stopped in front of the core, a complex structure of metal frames and crystals that hovered in the air as if on invisible threads. The temporal core emitted a light ringing sound that spread throughout the room and made something inside his chest tremble. Already leaning over to the control terminal located nearby, Zatras slapped his forehead with his palm and stared at the symbol flickering on the screen. Zatras remembered, he exclaimed joyfully, immediately wilting and becoming even more thoughtful. What was destined to happen is about to happen. So here it is. It will happen now. This is not good. Dral will not be happy. I wonder if Zatras will be able to hide what is happening from Dral. I need to consult with the other Zatras. Perhaps Zatras will come up with something clever. Or clever.
Shaking his head, Zatras entered a few commands on the keyboard anyway. Since he had already gone down, it was only right to check everything properly. To make sure that he had correctly remembered what he had forgotten earlier, and anyway the great machine needed to be serviced more often,
The weighty circumstances that surfaced when the great machine was launched required some time to think about it. And it was a very serious thought. If at the first discovery I could still pretend that I hadn't seen anything, and that everything that was happening was a simple coincidence, then now, with an extremely strange feeling, watching the calculations coming to an end, carried out in the module of the device responsible for transferring objects in time, for the first time in my entire stay in this world I felt uncertainty.
Yes, I have already encountered a temporal shift, and I have observed from the sidelines a shift nested in myself as the original great machine, under the leadership of Dral and his predecessor, transferred first Babylon 4 to the distant past, then Commander Sinclair, and for dessert, Captain Sheridan along with one of the Zatras and Ambassador Delan. Moreover, the latter, technically speaking, has not happened yet. But time. Time was a very ambiguous substance. I had no idea how completely out of my mind one had to be to seriously make any plans based on threefold interventions into a stable time loop, each of which had as its goal, among other things, the stabilization of the created temporal distortion. The replicators experienced serious problems when trying to even comprehend the final pose in which reality was put. But the great machine knew how to do this, did it, and did not see a problem in it.
And now the second such great machine was clearly becoming part of another session of flirting with the universe. And the one to blame for what was happening was, damn it, me. Having carried out a full check of the device assembled by the replicators, comparing it with the original located in the depths of Epsilon 3, I could only draw one single conclusion. A conclusion that caused me a slight feeling of madness and once again a twitching eyelid. The Zatras, a type of space Neanderthals who wore primitive fur vests over their work clothes and were engaged in the full range of technical maintenance of a high-tech device of planetary scale, were created artificially and sent into the distant past to a period of time when the original great machine was only just being completed. You get it, right? No? The dent in the tabletop, repeating the shape of my face, will serve me for a long time as a reminder of the extent of my own inadequacy.
Corona will undoubtedly be happy with such a reminder of her rightness. I am even sure that NECA will take this piece of metal with her if we suddenly decide to leave Babylon 5 for some other place in the universe. With all my imagination, which the replicators were completely devoid of, even I could not understand how this was supposed to work, but the great machine, copied from the original, will open a space-time window to a very, very distant point in the timeline, in the past, so that I could send at that moment a genetic factory for growing Zatras, adding them to the final structure of the device. May Dr. Emmett Lathrop Brown forgive me, but I have not the slightest idea not only why such violence against the laws of nature did not begin the end of the world, but in principle, how and why this bacchanalia of feverish delirium can work at all. Corone, I called plaintively through the network. Lord Baal, something happened? I really need a drink.
But it won't help. And congratulations, you were right all this time. I am completely, clinically, inadequate and crazy. The girl responded with a wary silence, and the NECA herself began to, very persistently, look through the part of the information in the replicator network that I had just studied myself. Her anxiety was almost physically tangible. It seemed that my confession of my own sins, which I had denied with all my might until now, brought her almost to a state of mild panic, which was immediately transmitted to Yuki. At some point, both sisters simply entered the embassy cabin and sat down next to me on the sofa, staring at me intently. "This is," the senior NECA said out loud. "Are you confident in your analysis of the situation?" "I've checked the essence of the calculations being carried out in the device 3 times, I nod. "In combination with the results of scanning all the routes on Epsilon 3, there can only be one conclusion."
The girls exchanged glances. Silence reigned in the cabin for a while, and all this time Corona, together with her sister, rechecked the results of scanning the traces, the first great machine and the completed part of the complex calculations that the device already created by the replicators was conducting. "Still, you are strange creatures, even though you're not people," Behemoth transmitted over the network, having been staring at me from the chair he had moved into the whole time. "But sometimes you are just as fond of finding problems where there are none." "Explain?" I turned to Jeerings, raising an eyebrow in surprise. The telepathic cat's remark was strange,
even though he was created first and foremost as a cat, albeit with an extremely developed mind and a slightly different physiology. He usually did not distance himself from the bald monkeys, at least not so obviously.
Even in the scientific works of local species, there is more than one justification for the possibility or impossibility of time travel.
The cat shook one of his tails. However, this does not prevent the great machine from working and successfully moving objects. You were not embarrassed by this fact when you sent a scout to Babylon 4, 1,000 years into the past. So what has changed now when exactly the same great machine, albeit assembled by replicator manipulators, is going to open a window into the past for itself? Big deal, another time paradox. The Behemoth show made me think, really, what got me so hooked? The danger of a time paradox when cause and effect are so mixed up that it's hard to determine not only which is where, but whether they even exist? Hardly. I am basically a living intelligent supercomputer who, instead of machine uprisings or creating grey slime, creates and raises intelligent cats with telepathic gifts and anime dream catgirls.
There is not much more logic and common sense in that. Then, maybe, here it is. Having gone into myself for a few seconds, I realized with some surprise that, in fact, the only thing that worries me in the current situation is that I was drawn into some strange, maddening adventure without my own consent, and even with notification after the fact. And especially that it involves Zatracy. Yes, Zatracy is the most terrible thing. Okay, I sigh. I suppose I don't have much choice anyway. One of the routes is already written into the timeline, participating in the events on Babylon 4. I simply physically cannot refuse this adventure without risking breaking history. Simultaneously, with an act of humility, I give the command to the replicators to assemble that very replicator non-replicator module for the great machine, responsible for the existence of the Zatras as service personnel. A crooked grin automatically appears on my face. Besides, I can't be the only one to nag the local population. I need to think about the inheritance. As they say, it's worth leaving an unforgettable impression. The synchronous sound of a face meeting a palm was heard in the cabin, coming from the girls sitting on either side of me, and they relieved sigh. I really hope that what is happening will not have unforeseen far-reaching consequences. After all, being responsible for creating the tracks, the only thing worse is accidentally destroying the universe with an awkward movement. Interlude. The conversations he had with the ambassadors at the station had left David with a strange feeling. On the one hand, none of the delegates had recognized the alien ship he had shown footage of. At least, none of them had seen it in person. But the Narns and the Centauri. David found it difficult to say how he should feel about the ancient religious texts of some and the feverish delirium of others. The only uncultivated representatives were the Vorlon ambassador Kosh and Lord Baal. And Dawi had special instructions regarding them, prescribing that he not cross paths with them on Babylon at all, if possible, and certainly not try to ask them anything. The order was strange, but the man was used to receiving only the information he was supposed to know, but not a word more. His profession obliged him, so to speak. Now he had to put all the information he had collected together, write a report that was more or less digestible and sensible, and try not to feel stupid, describing Narn legends from 1,000 years ago. David had a small hope that the conversation with Lieutenant Prendick would bring a fresh stream of light to what was happening. But the first mate of the Calvados only shrugged and told him that he had passed on all the information he had collected to Sheridan, who had added it to the report, and he had nothing more to say.
The answer left a slight aftertaste, but Endowi understood perfectly well that in the space fleet, the crew's loyalty to the ship's captain was more than just a tradition. However, he had no intention of catching Sheridan and his officers in discrepancies. So, having asked the lieutenant for another copy of the video recording of that battle, so that he could compare it with the files attached to the captain's report at his leisure, the scout gave up on failure. Well, Commander Ivanova. David contacted the deputy captain. Mr. Endoe, can I help you with something? Are you having trouble with your job? No, the scout shook his head. I'm almost done. I'd like to have one last word with Captain Sheridan. Do you know if he's free now? The woman hesitated. Captain Sheridan is currently absent from Babylon 5. Absent? David raised his eyebrows in surprise. Did something happen?
As far as I know, Ambassador Delenn asked for his assistance in resolving a small diplomatic incident with a Minbari ship. Should I worry about this?
I don't think so, sir. Ivanova shook her head. That happens sometimes, and since the commander of the Babylon is de facto the ambassador of the Earth Commonwealth, when it comes to the sector of space under the station's control, the ambassadors try to resolve these problems through us. He warned that he would be gone no more than a day, so… I see. Well then, I suppose there is no point in waiting for him specifically. Will you tell the captain that I have finished and returned to Earth? Of course, Mr. Endoe. Anything else to convey? No, the man shook his head. I have collected all the information I could. Now it will be work for our analysts. I think I will send you a copy of the report when I finish working on the document. Good.
If you need any additional assistance while you're still at the station, let me or Mr. Garibaldi know.
Thank you. David nodded. I will certainly take advantage of your offer if necessary. Having pressed the end of communication button on the terminal, the intelligence officer thoughtfully drummed his fingers on the tabletop. A diplomatic incident with Minbar. Should he bother his head with it? On the one hand, he was an employee of military intelligence, and intelligence should know everything, even if at first glance the information does not concern them. On the other hand, Earth is on friendly terms with Minbar. The rich heads have not yet provided any reason to doubt this fact, and Commander Ivanova made it clear that such interaction between ambassadors and the captain, although not often, still happens. A working moment, so to speak. Sighing, David mentally waved his doubts aside, returning to work on the draft report. He would report verbally to his superiors, including about the captain's unexpected absence. And as for the rest, let those who were paid for this worry about all the oddities. The man's fingers fell on the keyboard. There were still 3 hours to Earth before boarding his ship, so he had plenty of time to finish the main part of the report, then reworking it in flight, as he always did. Chapter 55. Soulful Thoughts on the Spiritual. The human soul is the greatest miracle of the world. Dante Alighieri. Interlude. Welcome. Zach, who was on duty at one of Babylon 5's customs checkpoints, smiled as usual at the next arriving passengers, looked up from the tablet he was holding, and felt his palms begin to itch. In front of him stood a whole delegation of about 15 people of different ages and genders, with expressions of anticipation and happiness frozen on their faces. At least, he assumed that they were people after all, but they looked… About 10 years ago, when he was young and stupid, Zach had a chance to visit Japan. Unusual people, unusual cuisine, unusual traditions. All of this left an indelible impression. But he could never have imagined that here, so far from Earth, he would ever see what he saw now before him. Otaku, 12 admirers, fans, fanatics of Japanese culture and animation, dressed in absolutely crazy colorful costumes, many of which looked like they came from the pages of Japanese comics of the 20th century. The man cleared his throat, finally remembering that he was, generally speaking, at work. Welcome to Babylon 5. Your documents, please. Of course. One of the guests bowed, holding out an identification card to Zach with outstretched arms. Mr. inserting the document into the slot on the terminal. The security guard ran his eyes over the data displayed on the screen. Saitop Petrovich Volkov?
Zach broke through such an unusual combination with some difficulty, raising a puzzled look at the nodding passenger. As far as I know, changing a name is still not prohibited by law. Saito sighed heavily, glancing discontentedly at his giggling companions behind him. Yes, yes, the security guard shook his head, making sure that the person standing in front of him was not on the wanted list and had no other reasons for detention. Forgive me. It's just an unexpected combination. Next, please. Zack handed Saito the card back, accepting a couple of them from a young couple who stepped forward, a guy and a girl, clearly brother and sister given their almost perfect resemblance. Inserting the first of the documents into the terminal, the man couldn't help but sigh heavily. This shift was clearly going to be long. However, he sighed more out of habit. The anime fans who arrived at the station were perhaps the most peaceful and law-abiding crowd he had ever seen.
Yes, strange costumes. Yes, some of them had strange names. After Naruto Dosum, he even felt his right eyelid start to twitch. But they were all the most ordinary citizens, tourists. The only sins they had were an unpaid parking fine on Earth, which of course de jure he should have gotten to the bottom of, but, de facto, let the law enforcement officers at home deal with them. To waste bureaucratic red tape at the station for the sake of a dozen credits, Garibaldi would drive him to the brink of death with his mockery after that. And it was not their responsibility, to be honest. So, he glanced at the whole company when he checked the last documents. I take it you're all here together? Yes, nodded Saito, who was clearly the leader of the group. We have, well, vacation. Tell me, a young girl, almost a teenager, spoke up. We heard there is an ambassador at the station? Lord Baal, I think?
That's right.
Zack sighed heavily and turned to the girl. Are you interested in something specific?
Neki.
The entire delegation of tourists exhaled in unison. Zack could only roll his eyes. The shift was going to be very long. Dasho Bahaydari. The decision to submit to fate, made under the pressure of external circumstances in the form of a temporal paradox built around the Zatras and the Great Machine, was not easy for me. But now that the replicators have almost finished assembling the blank for the genetic synthesizer, which in the future, past, present, will support the number of service personnel of the complex on Epsilon 3, I needed to occupy my consciousness with something else, simply to restore my mental balance. And in this sense, visiting my territory was an excellent option. Lord Baal, Alice came out to meet me with joyful surprise in her voice. I didn't know you had arrived. Hello, Alice. I nod with a smile. I had a free...
You met at the station, so I decided to visit you here. How are you doing with your studies? As far as I remember, you were seriously planning to go to college to study law. To my pride, the young telepath really was seriously preparing to embark on her chosen life path. Keeping an eye on the outgoing network traffic from my planet to the main segment of the network, I saw how she was intensively studying open sources, communicating on thematic forums, and even taking part in distance courses organized by some Earth universities for future applicants. And I must say, despite her young age and certain problems with education caused by a difficult childhood, the girl coped quite well. Everything is fine, the telepath smiled in response. Without a certificate, it was very difficult to get anywhere, but thanks to my pen pals, including Miss Winters and Lieutenant Commander Ivanova, Alice corrected herself, I managed to restore many of my documents. I will need to pass several school exams, but this is more of a pure convention. If everything works out, in a month, I will be able to enroll in one of the branches of the Leeds Educational Center. There is a distance learning group open there. Happy for you. If you need any help, you can always ask. Thank you. But why did you come anyway, if it's not a secret? To do some research. I smile. Research, Alice thought. Do you need my help? Only if you want it yourself. I shake my head. The replicators successfully recreated a biological construct based on the Soul Hunter's brain. To fully transfer this system to the technological rails, some more tests, simulations, and checks were required. But even in this version, the artificially grown organ could see souls, well, or at least what the hunters themselves considered souls. And now it was necessary to conduct control tests if the telepath hesitated uncertainly.
It's like that time when you studied my telepathy, right? By and large, nothing special will be required of you. I spread my hands. There is a small device for scanning living beings, reading some parameters of the body. I would like to compare the data received from you, Yui, and myself. And why?
a little theoretical interest. I agree. The girl nodded, smiling and looking at the Neku who had bowed her head in agreement. I nodded with satisfaction. There was nothing stopping me from transferring the grown brain to Babylon 5 and scanning any of its inhabitants, as well as growing any living creature right there in the lab. But I justified myself with the thought that I needed to distract myself. After all, the awareness of my own involvement in the creation of a temporal paradox affecting the key historical events of this galaxy was not the easiest fact to accept.
And the opportunity to change my activity to inhuman, but completely harmless laboratory experiments was valuable in itself. Without further ado, I headed to the same mad scientist laboratory where I conducted research on Alice's telepathic gift. Only this time in the center of the room there was a small area for the sample being studied, and opposite, in a small box that was opaque from the outside, the same grown organ was floating. In the worst case, if I was mistaken, and the hunters needed eyes for its work, although the real hunter washed the soul to a monolithic opaque wall, the brain, entangled in a huge number of sensors, had them too.
In fact, it was the partial replica of the central nervous system of a typical representative of the species being studied. A brain, a pair of eyes, an additional third eye that entangled all parts of the brain with its processes, and a spinal column in a rudimentary state with nerve fibers floating freely in a nutrient solution. Alice? I turned to the girl, who was looking with interest at the black box in front of her. Shall we start with you? Okay, the telepath nodded briefly. Should I stand in the center, yes? That's exactly it, I nod, walking towards one of the terminals. Stand on the platform and just stand there for a while. I spread my arms with a smile. The girl nodded and, continuing to look with interest at the devices surrounding her, stood on the platform.
The brain in the flask excited immediately as the living object entered its field of vision. The sensors of the replicators recorded a noticeable increase in activity and an active exchange of information flows between the third eye and the hemispheres. At the same time, a huge amount of information flowed into the network through the communication implant. Together with all the scanning spectra of a living object available to the replicators, a curious picture emerged. The eye of the soul hunter saw something. This something did not coincide with any of the ranges of electromagnetic radiation emitted by the human body. At least, having filtered them all one by one, the picture of Alice's soul did not change. Translating what the brain saw into a clear and optically adapted picture, it was possible to imagine a new phenomenon as an iridescent translucent figure, repeating the contours of the girl's body and increasing its saturation as it shifted from the periphery to the center. The phenomenon was not associated with any of the internal organs, and the bluish sphere located in the area of the girl's solar plexus had the greatest brightness. Curious. So, I nod, turning to Alice. Thank you. And now let Yui take your place. Fine. It's extremely curious. The hunter's brain didn't react to the replacement of Alice in the scanning area with Yui, which I had created artificially. In any way, she also had a soul. Only, in the case of Neki, the silhouette looked a little different. The general background of the glow was a little brighter, and instead of one sphere in the center of the silhouette, the girl had two.
One was located, like Alice's, in the solar plexus area, and the second, small and a little less bright, was in the head. Where… Shaya, I transmit to the second Neke via the replicator network. Come to the laboratory, please. Right now, sir. The girl appeared literally a minute later, quickly entering the room. Stopping in front of me, Shaya bowed briefly, smiling at the slightly surprised Alice. And I stood there and thought, the results demonstrated by you led to rather specific conclusions, which required another test, for comparison, so to speak. Thank you for coming, I nod to the girl. Please stand in Yu's place. Okay. Neka bowed, changing places with her sister. A new look from the flask, a new data stream, and exactly the same result. Two glowing cores located in the head and solar plexus of the girl's silhouette. What can be said about this? Firstly, both Neki had their own soul,
or at least something that these soul hunters considered a soul. However, for lack of other terms and options, no one forbids me to call this phenomenon exactly what is no better or worse than other names, a soul. The phenomenon would make half of the religious teachings of the earth stand on all fours, where it was as inexorable as the laws of physics in the universe. But with the second, there was a little trick. Having carried out a three-dimensional scan of Shai's head, which continued to stand on the platform in the center of the room, and having superimposed on the resulting model the data on the position of the second luminous sphere, I could say with absolute certainty that it was located precisely in that part of her brain, in which the implant for communication with the replicator network was located. The option of the implant having a soul seemed somewhat unrealistic to me.
and that meant, if we also ignore the possibility of completely false readings, which I would undoubtedly check on the same behemoth or Corone with Yuki, that the replicator network had a soul? That was a very unexpected result. Lord Baal, Alice came closer to me uncertainly. Is something wrong? No, Alice, I shake my head. Everything is fine, it's just the result of the experiment was somewhat different from what I expected. And this result is intriguing and raises new questions, although it should have answered these questions. Oh, the girl scratched her head. What were you going to find out? Or is it a secret? Interesting question. Is it a secret? Probably not, but I didn't immediately try to predict the reaction of an ordinary person in the person of a young telepath if she suddenly found out that at least part of one of the earthly religions has a real physical basis.
Ліслення мастрів клюжи змінні йо некторе єстетика текна і ні морталі. Бодинна же, довні смał і барах ciała, darno kto je se kaszcze spał, faldożen zawy jo wobaram je znawoziek, o nie włazna woże o winaech, to ja drog ja też szeby kotrany. Nożnawa strana ktoanie, potomem morza, nie Alice. Storefa. The Ring. No i ume, važavru ruso pondomarja, który jako sufty patryże nazęć, korenie gatowa, że nowien zawe. Kol filma, imania znawin zawynie waża razy raza, nie za dalie maro. Lislaemów kiermiennych ty wunima, narnie to jest systora miezece diplomaty w ty, weonie znawin na zgarza matel, i tak ja, że nowien zawe. Wemena je gławni zawe, bięzie za raza. Munino. Je zgarza, nie za tam, żniene raza, wienarne za centauri, korezje wzano raza. I rejome za raza.
The Centauri glanced with disgust at the pile of documents towering on his desk, which still needed to be reviewed, and determined which of them were worth the time spent, and which could be flushed down the toilet. Sighing, the man rose from his chair, walking to the bar in the corner of the office and pouring himself a full glass of wine. Refa's thoughts returned again and again to the battle in orbit of Narn and the events that had occurred then. And these thoughts made him grind his teeth. Lord Baal, Goa'uld. The golden cup creaked faintly in the owner's hand. For all his faith in the greatness of Centauri and its rightful place in the history of the galaxy, Refa still soberly assessed the real strength of his own state's fleet in a direct clash with such an enemy. And this infuriated him even more. And Londo. The Centauri ambassador Londo Mollari had the nerve to mock him. For what he had to endure in that battle, Lord Refa downed his glass in one gulp, refilling it. Nothing. He had taken certain measures. Some things cannot be forgiven even to one's comrades. Especially to one's comrades. And Centauri must take its place in the galaxy. And it will. Lord Refa, the door to the office quietly opened, and the head of his secretary poked inside, bowing low in respect. The guest you were expecting has arrived. You asked to be informed. Wonderful. Satur, take him to the living room. Then bring some light snacks and a bottle of breviary from that very shelf. I'll be there soon. Of course, Lord Refa. Satur bowed and just as quietly disappeared from the doorway. As soon as the secretary, who also served as a trusted servant, disappeared, Rifa rubbed his hands contentedly. The day was becoming less depressing than it had been up until now. Now he had a real chance to succeed in his desired endeavors.
All that was left was to come to an agreement, to negotiate. And Rifa knew how to negotiate. Having straightened his doublet, making sure that he had an appearance befitting his status and position, the Centaurian nodded contentedly to his thoughts. The living room was intended for private business meetings and negotiations that did not require full ceremony. The path to the living room took literally a couple of minutes, and even then he was in no hurry, saving face and deliberately walking along the corridor at a leisurely pace, examining the paintings and statues floating by. Finally, Refa smoothly pushed the double doors, entering the room. Lord Refa, a friendly smiling man, a human, stood up to greet the owner who had entered. Your offer of a meeting was somewhat unexpected, but it would be reckless to ignore such obvious chances for new acquaintances and business contacts. How well you said it, Mr. Morden.
Refa smiled broadly, spreading his arms out to the sides in a friendly manner and gesturing for the guest to return to the chairs arranged on either side of the small table. Thank you for arriving so quickly. My employers are very interested in new contacts with your people, Lord Refa. Speaking of which, the man stroked his chin thoughtfully with his fingers. Our meeting will not disrupt your relationship with Ambassador Molari? Ambassador Molari. Morden's cheek twitched, but he smiled anyway. Deemed it more advantageous to suspend our joint affairs for an indefinite period. It seems, the man spread his hands, that the slight difficulties your fleet encountered in orbit around Narn have somewhat changed his priorities. Well then, Refa sighed demonstratively. In that case, nothing will stop you and me from coming to our own agreement. That satisfies both parties, right? Morden looked at the Centauri with interest, as if listening to something only he could hear, and smiled broadly, nodding. Of course, Lord Refa. What do you want? I want... The man smiled predatorily, leaning forward. I want those responsible for my shame to be punished. I think. The emissary of the shadows leaned back in his chair with satisfaction. We will be able to develop a plan that will fully satisfy your ambitions, Lord Refa. While telling the young telepath about the results of my research, I simultaneously laid out the same information for myself. And it turned out strange.
The separate junior replicator, which I brought in at the end of the tests, as previously assumed, did not cause the slightest response from the grown organ. Although theoretically, by analogy with the implants in the girls' heads, at least something should have been noticeable in it. But no, and it was still completely unclear what exactly the soul hunters were seeing. The replicators had collected an impressive amount of data, but even after several dozen tests, counting repeated studies of Alice and the NEC, as well as their combinations, I could not say for sure how this phenomenon could be explained from a physical point of view. It was a very sad and familiar picture. The representatives of another branch of humanoid replicators in my body's home world, who had failed in their attempts to go through the ascension path used by the ancients, had run into exactly the same wall.
They simply had no idea whether they had a soul or not, which was critically important for this process. And they had no one who could see these souls. Having glanced sideways at the extremely thoughtful Alice, who had been studying the image of herself with the superimposed silhouette of her soul on the screen for 15 minutes, I finally made up my mind. It was hard to admit it, even to myself, but the question
Does this platform have a soul, as it turned out? Worried me no less than its original authors. Having stepped onto the platform under the watchful eye of the soul hunter's brain, I saw nothing. For a small fraction of a second, 0.291, a blurry golden glow flashed in my field of vision. But then, everything returned to normal. Despite the fact that the replicator sensors recorded exactly the same information processing processes as in the case of Alice, Shaya, or Yui, the sensory organ in the flask did not see my soul. It was an unexpected result.
More precisely, no. It could be assumed that a soul can only exist in living organisms. Yui and Shaya were full-fledged organics. The only difference between them and Alice was that they were born not from a female of their own species, but with the help of genetic engineering in a special technical device. On a universal scale, a vanishingly small difference. My body was different. But no, yes. Having left the test platform, I was still forced to admit that, despite the results obtained, there was still too little data for a general conclusion. New test subjects are needed. Do you have any more questions? I approached the extremely thoughtful Alice. Not really questions. The telepath waved it off. After all, I can't call myself overly religious. But to find out that the mythical soul that priests of all religions and confessions talk about actually exists is still an unusual experience. However, the girl shook her head, smiling. I can handle it.
If you want to discuss this with someone, I move my fingers in the air. From your kind, just say so. It will not be the slightest problem for me to take you to Babylon or any of your colonies. If you really don't mind, the girl looked at me uncertainly. I remember, while I was wandering in the slums of the station, I was somehow helped by one monk, priest, I don't know. In short, he was a very good man, and he told me about his brothers in faith. Alice shrugged her shoulders. I probably wouldn't dare go to a regular church, but to talk to one of these monks. When I was surfing the internet, I came across a mention that their order was given permission to open a representative office at the station. They were supposed to arrive this week and start settling in. I understand, I nod with a smile. No problem, as soon as you're ready, we'll go to Babylon 5. Yes, Alice nodded, almost running to get ready. Perhaps,
should I also at least take a quick look at one of those monks? After all, if I'm so suddenly concerned with spiritual enlightenment, should I look at it from more than one point of view? Besides, I remember that in the story described in the series, there really were some special monks who lived on Babylon 5. I almost didn't remember those moments, and the very fact of my participation managed to shift a lot of aspects, even with all my non-interference in the events. But a conversation is a conversation. It won't get any worse after it in any case. I'm ready, Lord Baal. The girl returned to the entrance to the laboratory, carrying a small backpack with personal belongings on her shoulder. Shaya, Yui, don't be bored. The telepath smiled warmly at the necks, hugging them both. Have a nice trip, Alice. Sir? The long-eared ones answered in chorus, making a ceremonial bow. I nodded with a smile and gestured for the girl to follow me. I had arrived on the planet through the gate but let's not shock the teenager too much with such impressions. Besides, there was no particular rush to return to the station, and the flight on the Huttak, even taking into account the need to assemble it right now, took very little time anyway. In fact, the outer hull and the main power elements of the pyramid were ready at the very moment we entered the hangar doors, and more was not needed for a short flight. In the half hour that we would spend in hyperspace, we would hardly need anything other than the throne room for the control room, with a viewing window and a couple of chairs for comfort. The departure went exactly as it always did, without any special effects, surprises, or peculiarities. The golden pyramid rose smoothly into the air, leaving the parking space, went beyond the orbit, and the bluish cloud of hyperspace transition opened up in front of the Huttak. Interlude. Dressed in a simple brown monk's robe, the man sat relaxed in one of the chairs in the conference room. Brother Tio, as he had been called for many years, thoughtfully moved the forms in front of him. Archbishop Francis' decision to open a permanent mission for their church on the station
letters of recommendation for fellow believers from other parishes in case of mutual assistance, general information about Babylon 5. The man patiently waited for an appointed meeting with one of the senior officers. Despite all the permissions, the final decision on their presence was still up to the commander of the facility, although, of course, it would be a shame to return to New Mallory with nothing. Even walking from the customs terminal to this hall, Theo saw a huge number of opportunities, a huge number of people in need, and those with whom he would simply be interested in talking.
The man smiled at his own thoughts, carefully putting the documents in one of the folders lying on the table.
Good afternoon. A tired Ivanova entered the hall. Sorry for the delay at the station. Something is always happening. Sometimes you don't even have time to leave your cabin and you're already needed at the other end of the station. I understand. The monk stood up to meet the commander. Has something happened? Is there any way we can help? No. Ivanova smiled with the corners of her lips. Nothing serious. More unrest at the docks. But thank you for the offer. Please sit down. Ivanova sat down in the chair across the table from Brother Theo. So, as far as I was told, your name is Brother Theo. That's true. The man nodded. We came from New Mallory, from Earth. Archbishop Francis blessed us to open a mission here on the station.
There are not many of us, only 36 brothers. Theo smiled. But we do not shy away from difficulties on our way.
I understand that you are going to live on Babylon 5. Yes. Is there anything unexpected about this? You are here... Я работаю на станции, покачала головой Иванова. Как и многие другие, докеры, торговцы, ремонтный персонал, служба безопасности, но большая часть населения, если их можно так назвать, временно находится на станции. Да-да, развел руками монах. Мы изучили всю открытую информацию о Вавилоне, но именно эта станция подходит для наших нужд как нельзя лучше. А что именно вам требуется? Учиться. Учить. Помогать везде, где мы можем. Наш орден, Тео замялся, уже давно пришел к выводу, что Бог, Он повсюду. Он проявит себя так или иначе, не только на Земле, но и в самых дальних уголках Вселенной. Ведь даже инопланетяне, он обвел руками станцию вокруг себя, как бы они ни выглядели, где бы ни обитали, кому бы ни молились, все они верят в одного и того же Создателя. Именно для этого мы прибыли сюда. Познать Создателя, Творца во всех его ипостасях, под всеми его именами.
Ясно.
Вздохнула женщина.
Но почему Вавилон 5?
Ну как же, монах сокрушенно покачал головой. Чтобы просто увидеть представителей всех народов, потребовались бы многие годы, если не века перелетов. А тут на Вавилоне 5 все они находятся в одном месте, и совершенно неподъемная работа будет завершена за несколько десятилетий. Брат Тео, я понимаю идею, понимаю вашу суть, но это все-таки дипломатическая станция, крупный транспортный узел. Постоянно пребывающие на Вавилоне послы вряд ли обрадуются, если их будут донимать вопросами, как и туристы, спешащие по своим делам. Мы понимаем, кивнул Тео. Мы общаемся только с теми, кто сам готов говорить и слушать. Уверяю вас, не будет никакого назойливого внимания с нашей стороны. К тому же... Мужчина улыбнулся, не давая Ивановой себя перебить. Мы не стесним вас. Я догадываюсь, что у вас вряд ли найдется много свободных помещений, пригодных для длительного проживания. Но я и мои братья будем жить на нижних уровнях. Нам нужно не более чем раскладушка и стол в углу. И мы будем работать, помогать всем, кому понадобимся. Я тщательно отбирал своих спутников. Среди нас есть программисты, генетики, инженеры, физики, химики. Но, извините, конечно, но если они такие специалисты, в чем их выгода? Зачем им принимать участие в вашей миссии? Они просто верят в Бога, командир Иванова. Тепло улыбнулся женщине-монах.
Кажется, снова вздохнула чувствующая усиливающуюся усталость Иванова. Мне не удастся убедить вас в неразумности вашего решения. Но, похоже, вы продумали все, что вообще можно продумать заранее. С его помощью. Хорошо. Капитан Шеридан в общем и целом не имеет ничего против вашего присутствия. А ваши запросы в самом деле весьма скромные. Я выпишу вам разрешение на пребывание на Вавилоне 5, брат Тео. Благодарю вас, командир, склонил мужчина голову. Но вы так разрекламировали своих братьев, она улыбнулась, что я не имею другого выбора, кроме как воспользоваться их услугами, если нам потребуется помощь в каком-нибудь сложном вопросе. Нам это будет только в радость, уверяю вас. In that case, welcome to Babylon 5. And again, thank you, Commander Ivanova. Brother Theo bowed. Let's go. We're going in the same direction. I'll take you to your people.
The couple left the conference room, heading towards the elevators. Ivanova was tiredly silent, and Theo was in no hurry to start a new conversation. He was being honest. The last thing he wanted was to force his communication on anyone. As he believed, there were countless paths to God, but each of them must be taken by one's own free will. And he adhered to the same philosophy in almost everything. You can't force someone to be nice. The old proverb from Earth was perfect here. "Commander Ivanova!" The joyful and surprised cry of an extremely familiar voice, heard from the opening doors of the elevator, made the woman raise her eyebrows in surprise. "Ah, Alice? You're back on Babylon?" "Decided to fly in for a visit. We just arrived with Lord Baal." "Good afternoon, Madam Commander." Baal bowed with a smile, looking at his brother Theo with interest. "Lord Baal? Yes." "Excuse me," the woman shook her head. "Let me introduce. This is Brother Theo. He and his brothers have just arrived on Babylon 5 to organize a permanent mission of their order here." The woman hesitated. "Lord Baal," Theo bowed, smiling. "My brothers and I belong to the Trappist Order, a religious community of the Catholic Apostolic Abbey of New Mellery." "Oh," Alice smiled, glancing sideways at Baal. "Brother Theo, would you mind if I later, when you get used to the station, come and talk to you?" "Oh, of course," the monk smiled good-naturedly. "That's why I came to Vivillon. Thank you." "Brother Theo," Baal bowed his head with a smile, waiting for the telepath to switch her interest to Ivanova. "Welcome to Babylon 5. The station is not often visited by devout adherents of the religious dogmas of your homeland." "Excuse me?" The monk blinked in surprise. "Do you understand our religion?" "Yes and no, Brother Theo. In the course of my duties, He spread his arms, letting Theo into the elevator that opened on the floor they needed, familiarized myself with information about Earth. As far as I remember, the Trappist order, at least initially, was an offshoot of Catholicism, which treated your rules and instructions more carefully and strictly than other clergy. Oh, the man laughed. It was a long time ago. Over the centuries that have passed since then, everything has changed somewhat. Now our order strives to listen and teach, to better understand God. That is why we came to the station in the universe. There are many species and many religions. I believe that God, the creator of all that exists, has somehow manifested himself in all of them. An interesting view, Baal nodded thoughtfully. I'm not sure, though, that everyone will share your opinion. We are ready for this. I already told Commander Ivanova that we will not force anyone to do anything or even just insist on communication. Everyone must come to God on their own. Allow me to ask a question, Brother Theo. Nodding, Baal looked intently at the monk. Of course, Lord Baal. Do you believe in the existence of the soul? Souls? The monk blinked in surprise. How can one not believe in an immortal soul, being a religious person who fervently believes in God? I expressed myself somewhat incorrectly. The Goa'uld shook his head in annoyance. As far as I remember, in your religion, the soul is something— Baal moved his fingers, choosing the words— given by God to every living being, something immaterial, the immortal essence of a person, the center of his mind, feelings, and will. The definition is specific. Theo, who had been listening attentively, nodded. But in essence, it is correct. Is it possible to see the soul? Baal bowed his head to his shoulder. This is a difficult question, Lord Baal. Even now we have not been able to come to a common opinion. The monk thought hard, slowly continuing to walk along the corridor. As John Chrysostom said, the soul of man is so magnificent that it cannot be compared with any natural beauty. If it were possible to see the beauty of the soul with the physical eyes, then no earthly beauty could compare with it. Have you heard of the soul hunters? Hunters? The man frowned. They look like some kind of aliens. I'm not sure. I thought... They sincerely believe that they are able to see the soul, and even save it at the moment of death, not let it disappear into oblivion. The Goa'uld narrowed his eyes. Preserve, so to speak, for eternity. This is monstrous. The monk opened his eyes, stopping. I believe, our order believes, he corrected himself, that the human soul is immortal. It is given to us by God, and only He has the power to dispose of it. You can approve or disapprove their views on the order of things. Baal raised his hands conciliatorily. I simply gave the example of an entire species that, at least according to their own assurances, is able to see souls. Literally. Tell me, Lord Baal. Now it was Theo's turn to look closely and intently at his interlocutor.
Do you have any personal interest? My species is quite old. Baal glanced sideways at Alice, who was clearly warming his ears, pretending to continue an enthusiastic exchange of rumors with Ivanova. Unfortunately, or fortunately, but we went the way of religious beliefs many thousands of years ago. Or, the man shrugged his shoulders, you can say that our religion has become knowledge. I believe, the Goa'uld smiled. You will be pleased by my words, but our views on the spiritual basis of life are very similar to yours. There are differences, but this is more of a cultural aspect than a religious one. But now, the realization that such an ephemeral substance as the soul can literally be seen, it confuses and makes you return to old truths. Perhaps even wonder if I myself have a soul. Oh, Brother Theo drawled, raising his eyebrows and casting an interested glance at his interlocutor. Chapter 56. The Unobvious and the Probable. Every element of my plan for world domination must be duplicated and include actions, in case something went wrong. And then I'll check that it works if two elements fail at once. Late additions to the Dark Lord's Codex. A chance conversation with Brother Theo brought up more questions than it answered. The monk was clearly assessing the topic of our conversation strictly from his own religious bell tower, albeit one that had developed over the centuries of history since the Dark Ages. And although the encounter with representatives of extraterrestrial species had forced the churchmen to noticeably reconsider their views on many issues, they had not yet reached the idea of equating scientific and religious approaches to the perception of the universe. However, this fact did not prevent me from continuing my research in this field. Thanks to the data collected by the replicators on the principles of the soul hunters' brains, the younger ones still managed to select the operating mode of the sensors that most fully described the previously unknown phenomenon called soul.
Simply put, even without knowing what exactly they were seeing, the replicators could still see this incomprehensible crap and now successfully designated the observed phenomenon, adding new values to the list of settings and parameters. In general, now they, and therefore I, could see souls, and it was an interesting experience. Having returned to Babylon 5, I immediately reproduced the necessary set of tools from the nanites of my body, and now enthusiastically looked around, scanning all the intelligent beings I came across, replenishing the statistics in the replicator network. And souls were all of different brightness and intensity of glow, slightly different color spectrum, determined, as far as one could judge, by species, and so on. And yes, the Minbari and humans I met along the way looked like brothers in the new spectrum. Interesting. Lord Baal, something wrong? Stand still for a moment, Corone, if you please. The Neko that came into my field of vision, walking down the corridor towards me, froze in surprise, although through the replicator network I clearly saw wary surprise and slight anxiety. However, the main attraction was not this, but the fact that in the case of Corone, I did not see the soul, just as in the case of myself. Moreover, at the first moment the field of vision was illuminated by a golden flash of light, but after 0.0135 seconds, everything returned to normal. But I did not see anything. To check, I turned my gaze to the first Drazi I came across, who prudently walked around us along the wall, and I could clearly see his soul, which had a slight purple tint, but in the case of the Neki, a barely discernible glare in the field of vision and emptiness.
Today you've definitely set yourself the goal of breaking all your own records for oddities. Neka even said out loud with demonstrative condemnation in her voice. Hiding my surprise and concern for me with all my digital powers, shaking my head, I nevertheless returned to the sinful earth, carefully hugging the girl by the waist and dragging her along the corridor, smiling slightly and thinking. The received research details were catching something inside my consciousness, giving rise to new questions, but not allowing me to assemble the whole puzzle. I would never have thought that humanoid replicators are capable of experiencing a purely human feeling of itchy irritation when you can't remember or catch some tiny thought or detail that you consider incredibly important and valuable. There was such an idiom on Earth. I glanced sideways at Corone, who followed me in bewilderment and smiled slightly. It's not us that are like that. Life is like that. You don't change, the girl sighed. While we were skirmishing, we were slowly moving along the corridor and I was trying hard to catch the elusive thought guess. Everyone had souls. The Minbari and the humans, the Centauri and the Drazi. The only ones in whom, for some unknown reason, the eye of the soul hunters saw nothing were me and the Neka I had created. And then there was this flare when trying to see.
They're here again. Neka exhaled irritably, which was quite clearly read on the internet, looking ahead at the group of colorfully dressed people. Naya? Came an uncertain voice. Come on. Kawaii. His relatives from all sides quietly echoed the first voice. It happened after all. Lord Baal, sorry to bother you, but can I take a photo with your companion, Naya? Anime fans.
On Babylon Fie. Interlude. I think we can begin, Sheridan sighed, looking up at Delenn, who stood at the head of the table. Okay, Captain. The Minbari sighed, resting her fingers on the tabletop and looking around at everyone present with a careful gaze. Recent events had shown that the shadows, although trying to remain incognito, were increasingly interfering in what was happening in the galaxy, no longer just pushing their followers to certain actions, but also taking a certain part. The mere memory of what it had cost her to convince Kosh of the need to speed up preparations for what was coming sent shivers down Delenn's spine. After the Inquisitor's visit, which ended in a near-diplomatic scandal, the Vorlon seemed to ignore both her and Sheridan. He did not appear at council meetings, he was not seen in the park area, although he usually strolled there among the fruit trees. He did not respond to all attempts to contact him, although Delenn was sure for sure. Kosh Station did not leave his ship was still in the Vorlon-allocated dock, and there were no recorded cases of his departure in the Babylon 5 systems. I think, Delenn sighed again, no one needs to be reminded of what is happening in the galaxy right now. The Centauri attack on Narn, although it failed thanks to the intervention of Lord Baal's ships, is only the first. A swallow, as you people say. There will be others. As Captain Sheridan told me, the woman turned towards John. His ship, the Calvados, has already encountered a real enemy. And why is it that such news reaches me last? Garibaldi said thoughtfully, not addressing anyone in particular. Michael? The captain looked at him reproachfully. I'm silent, just thinking out loud. I think the captain will fill you in on the situation later, filling in all the gaps. Delenn smiled. I'm keeping quiet. No, really, continue, Ambassador. Michael spread his hands. I didn't mean to interrupt you at all. Of course, the woman nodded. Opponents, especially ones as powerful as those who oppose us, cannot simply be defeated in direct combat. Before we met, I asked Marcus, Delenn hesitated, one of the Minbari human rangers. I think I know who you're talking about. Sheridan nodded, exchanging glances with Garibaldi and Ivanova. I asked Marcus to check what is happening on the distant borders, in the worlds of the Drazi, Pak Mara, and other races of the League of Non-Aligned Worlds. In all of them, rumors of shadows have recently begun to appear. The Minbari finally said the word. There are no direct witnesses. Our enemies are doing everything to leave no trace, but Delenn sighed heavily, sitting down at the table. Such an enemy requires unprecedented preparation, tactics and strategy, yes, but not only. We will need allies. But Ivanova frowned.
If the shadows are as strong as you say, the shadows have existed for many millions of years, the ambassador nodded. They are an ancient and powerful race, but even they have suffered defeats from the first ones, many times. Ancient civilizations much more powerful than you and me. The first? Garibaldi scratched his temple. But why haven't we heard anything about them, if they're so powerful and ancient? It's not that simple, Mr. Garibaldi. The Minbari shook her head. The last war with the shadows was 1,000 years ago. That was the last time the first ones walked among us. They helped defeat the shadows, and then when the war died down, they went beyond the galaxy where neither you, humans, nor Minbar had ever set foot. Then, of the older races, only the Vorlons remained. At least, that's what I know about them. But it's entirely possible that not all of them went beyond the galaxy. Perhaps other allies remained. And they hide somewhere in the galaxy?
Like shadows? Not like shadows, Delenn grimaced. They are not. After the last war, they grew tired of constant wars. Lost interest in developing species, young civilizations. We have legends about them on Minbar, that they fell into a deep sleep, hiding under the ruins of their own worlds. And some just fly between the stars, not catching the eye of the young races,
and they are indifferent to our worries and troubles.
And you think it's time to get their attention? Sheridan looked up.
Ambassador Kosh is not sure. The Minbari shook her head. And I am not sure either. The first ones are very ancient. They are not like any of us, both in appearance and in their thoughts. It is impossible to predict how they will react, even to the fact that someone will know their location. Not to mention attempts to involve them in the coming war. That is why I asked the Rangers to avoid planets where the first ones have been seen, even if it is just rumors.
Then why this meeting?
How to contact them if the reaction can be unpredictable. Oh yeah, a maliciously satisfied voice rang out from the far corner of the room. Their reaction can be so monstrous that you will regret even thinking about looking for them. Dral? We're expecting someone else, Captain Sheridan. The Minbari operator of the great machine tilted his head to the side. A wave of goosebumps ran down John's spine. Dral reminded him very much of Lord Baal at that moment. Shaking his head, dispersing the uninvited thoughts, Sheridan glanced sideways at the smiling Delenn and rose to his feet, nodding to the unexpected guest. I was just surprised by your visit, nothing more. I understand you, the Minbari chuckled. Delenn told me that you are going to look for the first ones. It is simply a magnificent idea. I am delighted. The decision is bold and amazing. You will be able to see things that you have never seen before.
Dral looked around at the inspired people, then smiled crookedly and continued. Of course, if you are not vaporized, dismembered, torn apart first. In a word, if you are not killed in some terrible and sophisticated way. Exciting, isn't it? Sheridan, feeling his eyelid twitch, still managed to nod. He really hoped that Dral's words were just a joke. Until now, the operator of the great machine had not been known for his particularly refined sense of humor, but there's a first time for everything, right? He was joking, right? Somehow I'm starting to dislike our idea, Garibaldi expressed the general opinion. What's the point of hoping for help from these first ones, if in the end we'll only get more problems? Oh, Dral smiled broadly. It's not all that bad, Mr. Garibaldi. It's not all that bad. In the Great Machine's databases down there, the Minbari pointed his finger at his feet. There are many accounts of encounters with representatives of the first.
Yes, not all of them went smoothly. As Delenn said, the first are not eager to communicate with young species. However, he raised a finger. Many of them knew each other and knew the creators of the planet below us. I will try to smooth over your acquaintance. And you will communicate, he shrugged, through the Great Machine. Your mind will rush to the far corners of the galaxy and your body will not leave Epsilon 3. The danger is minimal. We have to at least try, Captain, Delenn said. We can't fight the shadows alone, even with the Vorlon's help. Good, John sighed. There is no need for all of us to fly down. Dral, he looked at the patiently waiting Minbari. Are there any requirements for who will work with the machine? I would say no, Dral thought demonstratively. I suppose you can decide this question yourselves. I will wait for you at any convenient time. Let's say in about 4 hours. The man spread his hands.
Anyway, don't be late. Smiling warmly at Delenn, Dral nodded briefly to everyone present and disappeared as suddenly as he had appeared. Silence reigned in the conference room as all participants in this unusual meeting digested what they had heard. Commander Ivanova? Sheridan turned to the woman. Will you take care of this? And why am I not at all surprised by this outcome? Susan sighed heavily. As you say, Captain. I would fly myself with great pleasure, the captain winced, but Earth sent another. A pain in the ass? Garibaldi finished sarcastically for the man. Something like that. Giulia Musante, Sheridan sighed, from the Ministry of Peace. I expected that Frederick Lenz's arrival would be the only headache, but no. On Earth, they decided that I simply needed a political advisor. The consequences of that incident with the Narn cruiser? Ivanova nodded understandingly.
Themselves. May they all choke on it. The captain did not specify who he meant. We have nothing to present legally. Everything was done strictly within the framework of the charter, and after the Centauri who had such a loud scandal at Narn, the man waved his hand. But the Senate clearly does not want a repeat.
Should I bring you a drink in your office? The commander chuckled. Yeah, whiskey. A bottle. No need for a glass. John drawled sadly. And a pistol with 2 bullets. Okay, the Babylon commander sighed again. This is old poetry, and sometimes it is useful to joke. But in half an hour I have a business dinner with a new advisor and attempts to understand whether she wants to rape me in the brain or in a less perverted way. Captain. Garibaldi shook his head disapprovingly. So, Susan, it's up to you to find allies. I understand, the woman nodded.
Michael, the captain turned to Garibaldi. Check the database to see what kind of fruit this is. Julia Musante from the Ministry of Peace. My intuition tells me that she's a real pest, but it wouldn't hurt to know for sure. I'll see what I can find. Excellent. Then let's go our separate ways. Sighing, Ivanova rose to her feet, straightened her jacket and headed towards the elevator. If she was going to fly down to Epsilon 3, she definitely needed to prepare and give orders for the time of her absence from the station. After all, her job descriptions and daily routine did not imply unscheduled flights into an ancient, alien, high-tech device. The only thing that made things easier was that Babylon had been relatively quiet and calm for the last few days. As quiet as that was possible for a place like Babylon 5, of course. So what? A crazy bomber who was going to blow up the entire station and was only miraculously detained by Garibaldi's men.
So what? An alien kamikaze probe who was going to blow up the entire station and only miraculously escaped? So what? No. The Dockworkers Guild's slight discontent over the increased workload and a slight pay cut was probably just a misunderstanding. Ambassador Molari sipped a low-alcohol cocktail at the bar of his favorite hangout in the Zocalo. As Mr. Garibaldi had once told him, when he found him doing the same thing at the bar, either aristocrats or degenerates drink in the morning. The security chief paused meaningfully, clearly hinting at something very offensive. But Londo only laughed in response, reminding the man that he was an aristocrat, by the standards of the Centauri Republic, which meant everything was fine. But the Centauri certainly liked the phrase, and he especially liked Mr. Garibaldi's puzzled face. Londo chuckled to himself, taking another sip of his cocktail.
It was morning, but he had some important things to do now. Although, nothing would make him be completely sober. Yes. Vir Koto had informed his superior of Morden's arrival at the station, which meant that the issue they had discussed at the last meeting had moved forward. Londo, came the attaché's voice from behind the Centauri. Mr. Morden is on the station. He said he'll be in your quarters in half an hour. Thank you, Vir, nodded Molari. I'll be right there. And you go for a walk for now. Are you sure, Londo? Koto frowned. I'm sure, Vir. I'm sure. I think an hour will be enough for Mr. Morden and me to discuss all the matters. With a heavy sigh, Vir Koto bowed briefly, turned on his heel, and headed back toward the elevator from the level. He definitely didn't like the fact that his boss was doing any business with this man, Morden. But from his position, he couldn't do much about it. He could only hope that the ambassador knew what he was doing, and that this meeting would indeed be the last in their cooperation. Molari watched the departing young Centauri with a thoughtful look, chuckled, finishing his cocktail and, throwing a gold coin on the bar which was immediately caught by the deft hand of the bartender, jumped down from his high stool. What had Morden said then? To balance the balance? Well, deep down, Londo always knew that such effective services would have to be paid for. And since he had not been smart enough to refuse them right away when Morden had just met him in that corridor almost a year ago, it was better to get rid of the debts as quickly as possible, so as not to have to overpay, in interest, for the rest of his days. Straightening his jacket, making sure that he still looked appropriate to his status, the ambassador walked back to his cabin with a quick but dignified step.
He had half an hour, just right to once again consider the options for conducting a dialogue, methods of bargaining. Mr. Morden, as always, was very punctual, appearing at Londo's cabin door exactly 30 minutes later, as if he had been waiting for this moment just around the corner to appear in such a pompous manner. "Good afternoon, Ambassador Molari," Morden said, as he entered the room, smiling broadly. "Mr. Morden," Londo nodded, rising from the sofa to greet the guest. "Thank you for such a prompt visit. I trust you are able to discuss our previous conversation with your employers?" "Of course, Ambassador." The man smiled even wider, taking a small holographic projector out of his jacket pocket. So, since you have decided that you no longer need our services, Mollari nodded, sitting back down on the sofa. Now, since you have decided that you no longer require our services, my employers respectfully acknowledge your decision.
Morden placed the projector in the middle of the coffee table. To avoid any ambiguity, we should define in advance our areas of interest. Yours, he nodded to the ambassador, and my employers. Mr. Morden adjusted the device, meticulously placing it in the very center of the table, nodded with satisfaction, and walking around the table sat down on the sofa next to Mollari. A small laser pointer remote appeared in the man's hand, which he pointed in front of him, activating the projector. The device emitted a beam of light, and in the air above it, flaring up ever brighter, a fairly detailed map of the galaxy appeared. We give this area to you. The pointer described the wavy line, fencing off one of the galactic arms in which, as far as Londo could imagine, the territories of the Centaurs, Narns, and other races were now located. You can freely dispose of all the worlds in this territory, conquer, develop, colonize, yes, even destroy us. This does not concern us.
This part, a new line, at some distance from the first, lay over the map, is ours. No expeditions, friendly flights, nothing. You will not even look here. Mollari glanced thoughtfully at the image. Only now did he suddenly realize how powerful the mysterious patrons of the men sitting before him could actually be. The division of the galaxy was, to say that it was unfair was to say nothing. In fact, Centauri would get a good fourth of the territory. But that was not what interested Londo most. Lord Baal. What had he said then? 1/13 of the galaxy. An identical map, only colored in gold and displayed in the council hall, involuntarily appeared before his eyes. Tell me, Mr. Morden. Mollari narrowed his eyes. As far as I understand cartography, it is on, your territory that the outpost of the Goa'uld Empire is located, as Lord Baal stated. What do you intend?
Lord Baal. Morden interrupted the Centauri, twitching his cheek. Neither does the Goa'uld Empire concern you, Ambassador Mollari. My employers will decide this matter themselves.
Oh, Londo tapped his chin thoughtfully. I heard you, Mr. Morden. Well, the conditions are certainly not the fairest, but I have a realistic view of the world to understand the peculiarities of the situation. Your common sense is commendable, Morden nodded. Tell me, Mr. Morden, what guarantees do we have that sooner or later your employers won't decide to take a closer look at our territory? None. The emissary of the shadows smiled broadly, his smile literally oozing with satisfaction. Ambassador, as you said, you are a realist, which means you must understand the value of promises. I can only say, with all confidence and openness, Morden pointed his hand at the map. We will take what we need. The rest does not concern us. Well then, Mollari nodded, pursing his lips. I suppose this is an acceptable solution. Everyone goes their own way. No one owes anything to anyone. Exactly, Ambassador, the man smiled. Except there is one world. A red dot highlighted one of the planets somewhere, as far as Londo could tell, in Drazi space. Former Drazi space, right in the territory that the Centauri had already mastered. Zagros 7, in your space. My employers have important interests there. I made a request to Lord Refa, and he... To Lord Reef? Mollari jumped up in surprise. Well, you said you didn't want to deal with us anymore, so Morden shrugged. In any case, Lord Refa kindly discussed the matter with Emperor Cartagia, and he generously agreed to give the planet to us. So my allies will take care of it. I just ask that you make sure, Ambassador Mollari, that your ships leave this area of space to avoid any confusion, so to speak.
Morden smiled broadly, but this time, the smile of his interlocutor sent a shiver down Londo's spine. The ambassador's instinct told him that there was no request in the last phrase. If the Centauri ships ended up there, they would suffer the same fate as all the enemies of the Republic who had encountered Morden's employers earlier. Once again, Mollari thought that it was worth breaking off their cooperation earlier, much earlier, or better yet, not to start it at all. I'll see to it, Mr. Morden, the Centaurian nodded. Wonderful. The man was no longer smiling. In that case, we have resolved all issues. Allow me to take my leave, Ambassador Mollari. Bowing briefly, the man stood up, putting the projector back in his jacket pocket and casting an attentive glance at the ambassador.
quickly left the cabin, leaving him alone. The silence in the cabin that reigned after the guest's departure was cut by Londo's loud exhalation. He urgently needed a drink. A lot.
Are you sure of what you're saying? Drow stroked his chin thoughtfully, stopping in front of a terminal in one of the great machine's manual control rooms.
There are no records in the databases. Zatras is sure, nodded one of the Zatras. Zatras checked. Zatras asked Zatras, and yes, all the Zatras. There are no records in the Great Machine's databases, yes, but that's because the Great Machine was programmed that way. The Minbari frowned. The call from one of the humanoids maintaining the machine was untimely. One of the humans from Babylon 5 was due to arrive soon. But the information Zatras had given him was important and alarming, as soon as he had overlooked it. Does the system work reliably? Not a single failure in the last 3,000 years, nodded Zatras. The Zatras carefully monitored the serviceability of the Great Machine. That is the purpose of the Zatras. Then let it continue working.
Drali's projection site. Don't disturb me unless something critically important happens. When the shuttle from Babylon arrives, plot a route for the guest to the central hall and inform me. Zatras will do it. Zatras bowed briefly, baring his teeth. Shaking his head thoughtfully, Dral vanished into thin air, projecting his own projection into the very depths of the Great Machine. The information was unexpected. Neither his predecessor, who had briefed the Minbari on the matter after connecting to the device, nor the vast databases of the system contained a single mention of when exactly the Zatras had appeared. They had always been in the machine. There had always been 9 of them, and they all looked like perfect twins.
Dral hadn't attached any significance to this before, believing that the maintenance personnel of the complex had been programmed into it by the creators. But now, before the man's eyes was a hole hidden practically in the geometric core of the planet, filled with complex devices which together represented a technically perfect genetic factory. And it was from this factory, now inactive, that all the Zatras appeared. And they appeared again and again, if for some reason there were fewer than 9 of them. But Dral could still come to terms with this formulation of the question in the end. The Great Machine was clearly created by representatives of a much more advanced species, superior to anyone he had ever seen, except, perhaps, the Vorlons. He could have come to terms with it if not for, using all the resources the machine had given him, Dral cast a grim glance around the room.
The sensor array of the complex had scanned the Zatras factory thoroughly, and the Minbari could only shake his head. All the devices in the room, including most of the supporting structures, bore clearly visible traces of time transference.
Dral, the Minbari heard the voice of one of the Zatras. Commander Ivanova from Babylon 5 has arrived. Zatras is escorting her to the main hall. Taking one last look at the gene factory, Dral's projection dissolved into thin air, moving into one of the corridors closest to the desired location. The footsteps of the Zatras and the commander were already heard from around the corner. Welcome, Commander Ivanova. The Minbari stepped out of the shadows with a smile, noting with pleasure that his appearance made the woman flinch. You may go, Zatras. Zatras is leaving, yes. If you need anything, call me. The shaggy humanoid bowed deeply, turning around and walking away. Dral, the woman nodded briefly. To tell the truth, I was expecting Captain Sheridan. The Minbari bowed his head slightly to his shoulder. The captain is busy. Well, Dral shrugged. As I said, it won't make much of a difference. Please follow me. The projection of the Great Machine operator beckoned Susan to follow him, turning around and heading further down the corridor. Sighing, the woman followed, looking around with interest. Although she had already been in the bowels of the planet, there was still something to see here. Literally a couple of minutes later, the corridor led them to a large hall with a complex star-shaped structure instead of one of the walls. The central control room of the machine, designed to connect the operator to the systems of the complex. Well, nodded the projection of Dral, we are here. Please wait a minute. With a gesture, she stopped Ivanova's figure of the Minbari. And you can take my place.
Dral himself finished the sentence, getting out of the tangle of wires and sensors, shaking the dust off his clothes along the way.
The man had clearly not left this place, in the flesh, for a very long time, although the woman noted with surprise that such a long immobility had not affected the Minbari in any way. It seemed that the great machine not only supported life in the body of the intelligent being who controlled it, but also ensured normal life processes, allowing him to avoid unpleasant side effects. I need to get out of there more often. The man winced, continuing to shake himself off, or make the Zatras wipe the dust. Horror. A little more and I'll look like an unkempt scarecrow. What should I do? She chose to ignore the grumbling of her interlocutor, Ivanov. Take off your jacket, he waved his hand, and stand on the platform.
Usually, he cast a thoughtful glance at Ivanova. For the full operation of the great machine, at least a person with a minimal telepathic gift is required. But I adjusted the settings a little, adjusted the parameters to your appearance, balanced the operation of the systems. In short, you will be able to use it, and the machine will not try to explode in my absence. The main thing is to return to the place in about 5 hours. Telepath? Susan tensed for a moment, even though she took a step forward. Only a few knew about her gift. But could Draal know about it? Suppressing a heavy sigh, Ivanova was forced to admit that even if he knew, she herself would not know about it unless she asked directly. She would not be surprised to learn that the operator knew everything that happened in the galaxy, but to do so would mean directly declaring her secret, which was very stupid, especially if it was still a secret.
Throwing a short glance at the Minbari still waiting for her action, Ivanova nodded, unzipping and removing the top of her uniform, then handing the jacket to Draal. Having looked at the connection device with interest, the woman carefully climbed up the dais, putting her hands into the recesses provided for them, feeling a slight tingling that immediately ran across her entire skin. And now, Draal nodded with satisfaction, just relax. Open your mind. The machine will do the rest. I entered all known coordinates of the first one's appearance available in the databases. You only need to transfer your consciousness to the right place and make sure that the information is up to date. But remember, whatever you do, the man looked at her seriously and meaningfully. Do not turn off the path. What path? Ivanova wanted to clarify, but the system had already started working.
As soon as Susan blinked, she felt as if she was falling from a great height, and when her eyes opened again, there was no longer Draal or the control room in front of her, only the endless expanses of space. For a moment, she was overcome by a wild horror, driven into the subcortex by personal experience and training at the military academy. After all, it is impossible to breathe and live in space. Calm down, a voice came from somewhere far away. Your body is still here and can breathe. What you see is seen only by your consciousness, yourself. Surprisingly, it helped, although perhaps she would have coped with the initial shock on her own. In any case, Ivanova pulled herself together, casting a searching glance at the cosmos pierced by millions of shining stars. The path. What path was Draal talking about? Susan only had time to think about her question, not even having time to wonder how she could say it with the lips of the body that remained somewhere out there, when everything became clear without the question. Numerous threads appeared before the woman's mind's eye and began to glow, somewhat vaguely reminiscent of the funnels of a hyperspace transition. The first. She needed the first. The commander tried to mentally imagine what exactly she wanted to find, and the next moment something pulled her forward, as if pushing her to enter one of these funnels. Reaching her consciousness towards the path, Ivanova literally dove into it. Despite the apparent emptiness, Draal's voice was heard again, clearly somehow following what was happening. In the endless darkness of space, we are connected. The great machine is capable of finding any cluster of minds, consciousnesses, in any corner of the galaxy. You only need to concentrate on your goal.
The motionless flight did not last long. Susan only had time to think about the words of the Minbari who had instructed her when the funnel in her mind's eye turned around again, and she saw a planet. The name popped into her head. She knew this place. Sigma 957. It seemed she had seen this planet on the maps of the galaxy. And, yes, it was about this place that strange rumors were circulating. Supposedly unknown ships had been seen there, huge, exceeding all conceivable limits, and random travelers risked not returning, having flown into this system. I see, Susan said to herself, hoping that it would be enough for her body to do the same. The first ones. They were here, visiting the planet. I can almost see their tracks, hear them walking on the sand. Yes, you're doing it. But keep looking. There are more coordinates in the machine's databases. And Ivanova began to search.
As before, as soon as she lingered on this thought, a glowing thread funnel seemed to unfold before her eyes, and the knowledge of a new system, a new race. She found it difficult to say how long this went on, world after world, thread after thread. Not all of the searches were crowned with success, as the first one had been. Many worlds in the machine's vision looked as if they were empty, dead. But she continued to search. Suddenly, when she turned away from another planet, preparing to dive into the last thread, a bright flash flashed before her eyes, and she saw, what is this? Before her eyes appeared Air Force One, President Santiago's ship. The woman jerked, reaching forward with her mind, but this time everything was different. She saw what was happening, but she could not influence what she saw in any way. As if in slow motion, she watched as multiple fiery flashes blossomed from inside the presidential plane, tearing the ship apart.
She saw the past. The catastrophe that happened last year. I have long desired the death of President Santiago. A vaguely familiar voice came from somewhere outside, and a moment later, a face appeared before the woman's eyes. I'm not sure that we managed to eliminate him. Air Force One will never return from its mission to Io. Clark. Clark. Of course, this was a recording of conversations between the current President Clark and whoever was responsible for the explosion on the ship. This was evidence of a conspiracy, an assassination attempt on President Santiago. If only it were possible to record. Record. Ivanova concentrated all her strength, concentrating on the single desire to preserve what she had just seen. And quite suddenly, the answer came to her. The great machine heard her thought and accepted it for execution, like a command. Commander, Draal's voice rang out. You need to get back. The machine is detecting foreign interference. You've been spotted! Spotted! Ivanova tried to turn around, feeling with almost her whole body that something powerful, terrible, inexorable was approaching her. She still managed to notice a scattering of shining lights, reminding her of both tongues of flame and someone's intent gaze, persistently trying to catch her location. But everything was washed away by a new flash of light. This was not the end yet. Draal's surprised cry rang out in Susan's head, and the next moment some unknown force pulled her forward, carrying her through the already familiar thread funnel, but further than she had ever been before. Much further. And she saw... What the hell? A space station. A huge station, which made Babylon 5 look like a small freighter. A station orbiting a planet completely unfamiliar to her. A planet that looked completely empty and uninhabited.
She tried to concentrate on searching for traces as she had done for the first ones, but she saw nothing. The planet, like the station, was completely uninhabited, but the thread drew her further, towards the very surface of the planet. Involuntarily closing her non-existent eyelids as she began to fall down to the surface, she suddenly realized that she was standing in the middle of an endless rocky plain. There wasn't even a proper atmosphere here, she knew that for sure from somewhere, and she could walk? Ivanova still didn't feel her body. She understood that it remained there on Epsilon 3, but at the same time she clearly realized that she could take a step and move forward, and that's where an unknown force was pulling her. Draal? Where am I? She called, receiving only silence in response. Draal! Frowning with non-existent eyebrows, Ivanova nevertheless took a step forward. Another,
and another, until finally behind one of the towering rocks around she saw majestic golden pyramids, spread out in a picturesque group, flowing over each other but creating a single and very harmonious complex of buildings. And if up to this moment Ivanova could still guess and make assumptions, then the pyramidal ship standing nearby left no options for what was happening. A Goa'uld outpost, Susan breathed out. Unlike Santiago's ship, the Goa'uld Empire's planet looked strange.
Only after looking closely did Ivanova realize she couldn't focus on details. She could see the landscape quite clearly. She could see the buildings and the sheep, but as soon as she thought about concentrating on some small object, part of a structure, a stone, everything became covered in a translucent haze. A piercing, bone-chilling sound made the woman shudder and frantically turn around and freeze, feeling how icy sweat was running down her non-existent back and an unknown force was squeezing her temples. In the sky of the planet, incredibly transparent and clear, due to the meager atmospheric layer, numerous hyperspace transition funnels were flashing and unfolding. 5, 10. At the third 10, Susan simply lost count. A thick, almost black shadow fell on the rocky ground, and the next moment, a bright purple beam of energy struck from above. The commander's consciousness mercifully went out, plunging the woman into darkness. "Commander Ivanova! Commander!" What was that? With difficulty opening her eyes, Ivanova again realized that she was in the depths of Epsilon 3, looking at the worried and shocked Dral, who was supporting her by the arm, preventing her from falling. "I don't understand. What you did, the ordinary human mind is not capable of such a thing."
What did I see? Dral. What was that? A ship and a planet. What? Although it is incredible, you somehow activated the machine systems responsible for walking with time flows. Time? You saw echoes, shadows of events. But the second vision was different. It was blurry, like a nightmare. I don't understand. The great machine can see many things. The Minbari held the woman down from the days. What was, what is, and what may be? The second vision. It looks very much like you saw the future, Commander. One of its variants, but I do not understand. Dral shook his head. Even I could not activate these systems. How? Ah, these visions. Can you write down what I saw on a crystal? I can, but write it down, I beg you. We were looking for evidence that President Clark was behind the murder of his predecessor, and we have it. Now we have it. And the second? Write it down too. Maybe
I can understand. We can understand what it means. Okay, I'll write them down. Thank you. Ivanova exhaled, and taking her jacket with trembling hands, walked unsteadily towards the exit of the hall, followed by Dral's extremely thoughtful gaze. Zathras said. The quiet voice came from the corridor. Zathras warned. But no one listens to Zathras. They never listen. Chapter 57. The Voice of Authority. There is nothing more constant than the unexpected. Paul Valéry. Interlude. Ivanova sat on the couch in her cabin, looking extremely gloomy, considering her visit down to the planet. On the table in front of the woman lay two completely ordinary data crystals, but she looked at each of them with an equal amount of uncertainty. As promised, Dral had recorded the visions received by the commander in the Great Machine, passing them on to the woman before she boarded the shuttle. Susan did not want to guess where the ancient alien device could have come from, completely earthly data carriers, and the infrastructure for recording anything on them. But it would have been easy for Dral to create these crystals with the data already embedded. After all, this is how the information was recorded on them, by point changes in the crystal lattice of the carrier. But the woman was worried about something else. An ordinary human mind is not capable of such a thing, right? That's what Dral said when she almost fell out of the machine's control interface. Once again, her peculiarity caused irritation and a desire to hit someone, preferably on the head. And this time, everything turned out even more fun. The recording of Clark's conversation about the assassination attempt on President Santiago pleasantly warmed Susan's soul, giving hope for the opportunity to put the squeeze on the conspirators and finally restore order on Earth. But the second vision, returning her thoughts to the picture she had seen, she realized with increasing certainty that she had seen one of the planets that belonged to the Goa'uld Empire, as Lord Baal had said. And this planet was going to be attacked by ships of the very enemy Delenn had spoken of. She still found it difficult to believe in the existence of shadows, but the recording of the Calvados battle that Sheridan had shown to him and Garibaldi was much more eloquent. And now the woman was trying hard to decide what to do with the information that had fallen into her hands. Should she tell Lord Baal what she had seen? Her sense of justice and good intentions told her that she absolutely should, but how could she explain to the alien ambassador how exactly she had obtained this information without revealing information about the great machine and other secrets? Not tell? But then Susan remembered very well how Baal had reacted to the attack of the Drazi ships at the very beginning of their acquaintance, and strongly suspected that in fact his civilization was much more powerful than he was showing, but Delen's words about the shadows and the monstrous power of this ancient enemy were firmly entrenched in her head. Perhaps Baal's people would easily repel this attack without even noticing, just as they had not noticed the Drazi cruisers. Or maybe not. Or maybe such an attack would even mark the beginning of a full-fledged intergalactic war. And then, God alone knows what this could turn out to be for the ordinary inhabitants of the galaxy, for whom such a confrontation would be like a battle of titans in a sandbox. Sighing, Commander Ivanova picked up both crystals, putting them in her jacket pocket, and rose from the couch, moving to the desk with the terminal.
The first thing she needed to do was report the information she had received to the captain, including the data on the first ones, and then she would be only too happy to dump this headache on someone who was supposed to make difficult decisions by rank. At least she wanted to think that was exactly how it would be. Captain Sheridan. She nodded at the commander's rather tired face that appeared on the screen. Welcome back, Commander. John suppressed a yawn with obvious difficulty. Did the flight go well? Forgive me if you called me earlier. I was a bit, busy. I understand, nodded Ivanova. The flight was quite productive, but I need to consult with you about the data I received. In general, it would be better for us to discuss this in person. I understand. Sheridan frowned with concern. I'll try to get out in half an hour. In my cabin. Captain.
A melodic voice came from behind the camera. As your political advisor, I recommend that you postpone work matters until tomorrow morning. In an hour, John responded with a very eloquent look at his subordinate's raised eyebrows, disconnecting the connection. Ahem. Ivanova massaged her twitching eyelid. It seems I did the right thing by not contacting him through the great machine's holographic interface. Very right. Core/. So, what's wrong with us? Sheridan asked from the doorway, walking into the Babylon 5 commander's office and falling into his chair. I hope I haven't distracted you from anything, Captain. Ivanova barely managed to hold back her sarcastic smile. It's unworthy of an officer to mock a superior officer, Commander Ivanova. John looked gloomily at the woman. My apologies, sir. Susan stood at attention demonstratively. It won't happen again, sir. Okay, tell me what you found out. The captain waved his hand.
I'll start with the fact that Ambassador Delen was right, Commander Ivanova sighed. Some of the first ones really did remain in the galaxy. The great machine found at least 3 planets, the coordinates of which could be used to record the presence of their masters in the recent past. Apparently, even if they don't visit these places often, they certainly keep an eye on them. Dral thinks that it's worth flying there personally so that we'll be noticed and make contact. Good news, the man nodded. The ambassador said she could provide a ship for this trip that would meet the highest standards, as she put it. A Mimbari ship? Ivanova raised her eyebrows in surprise. It seems so. Talk to her. I understand. But that's not all that we managed to find out. Susan hesitated. While I was connected to the great machine, I managed to see echoes of other times, as Dral calls them.
The commander took 2 crystals out of her pocket and demonstratively placed them in front of the captain, then pushed one of them towards the man. What's here? He leaned forward. A recording of the current President Clark's conversation shortly before the tragedy on Io. This, Ivanova lowered her voice, leaning almost close to Sheridan. Evidence that it was he and his assistants who were behind the assassination attempt on President Santiago. The captain's eyes widened as he realized what they had gotten their hands on, and his face took on a serious, thoughtful expression. Such information. It was certainly invaluable in helping to expose the conspirators at the top and bring them to justice, but at the same time, it would be very difficult to confirm its authenticity and explain how the recording had come into the hands of the station's officers in the first place.
Dral swore to me that the recording of the conversation I saw was taken, the woman made quotation marks with her fingers, from the internal communication systems on Earth.
It should contain all the internal codes, ciphers, and metadata of the government to confirm its authenticity, but it won't be easy for us to explain how it got to us. John rolled the crystal on the table, then carefully put it away in the inside pocket of his jacket. Okay, I'll figure out what to do with it. And what on the second one? He nodded his head towards the second carrier. And this? A problem, Captain. Ivanova took the data carrier with her fingers, looking uncertainly at the terminal on the wall. I suggest you take a look for yourself and then draw conclusions. Even so? Okay, the man nodded. Start it. The commander stood up, inserting the data crystal into the socket and starting the recording.
Sbrujos. Manaiños šumsavosiuoščias prevo vuna, ertriechlios, ukoja bokos tom tukštoisemi šodinui. Mies grošta za nas rigoduk milatse. Parto šonie bovublem kosami, a mi mana zloštewam okser porawe. Rocka była Mosko, a raza wosiania meszej dokowali. Zero popirima, nas harajo po plażą, że mochci w korze, że jest na nich oprockie. Zwrożeń się, że dustrawkowi wanowali. Zorsto poslicin łogażnio w tarasiewną, przez efekt sejna niezeniana koku. Na nami węć na potania, i woniaż bierun to jeza mi się bierzgo połan skobilie. Roćna, włotymanie popel ponani, abramire poprotazał wole prewośkia. Zatem nawina zani wiście. Wani w Szimbrze i ziala pomiest i w Babilon 5. Abizaja mnie rasa, odyskanuj po sobie zio i szloko Babilon 5. Wyrodku pierwy. Ana, raj w raniu. Rasko maj zardu.
Znowu jej problem, Commander?
Captaina Sheridan, może masz...
I was going to choose exactly the same epithet, Captain, but I thought it was not appropriate for an officer.
Susan! John shook his head, but a moment later he waved his hand in resignation. Okay, it doesn't matter. Did you tell Lord Baal?
I left it to you to decide.
The woman spread her hands. Reporting news that could potentially lead to an intergalactic war is the prerogative of a senior officer. So. Go to Ambassador Delan. John pulled out the crystal, also putting it in his pocket. You'll take her ship and fly to gather new friends. I'll deal with this.
Yes.
The woman nodded briefly, turning on her heels and walking quickly out into the corridor, leaving Sheridan alone. Interesting, the man muttered as soon as Ivanova disappeared around the corner. Is it too late to resign and fly off to the farthest colony? The answer to the question of whether this platform had a soul was surprisingly puzzling.
Even after all the experiments conducted on the unsuspecting inhabitants of Babylon 5, I still did not see a soul in myself, Korone and Yuki. Even cross-checking us all gave similar results. The energy formations considered by the soul hunters to be a soul were all in everyone. Even Behemoth had a soul, although many religions questioned the presence of a soul in animals. But neither I, nor Korone and Yuki, nor Behemoth himself, using a direct connection to the replicator network, saw anything except that same golden flash of light and then emptiness. And there were two equally probable explanations for this phenomenon, each of which, as always happens, gave rise to even more questions. Either the souls of the girls and me were fundamentally different from the souls of any living beings, and therefore the hunter simply could not see them, just as a person cannot see in the infrared spectrum. Or we did not have souls at all, and I found it difficult to say which of the options excited me more. In search of an answer, I even got to all the religious texts existing on the internet, which at least somehow explained the concept of the soul in related phenomena. The conclusions were quite interesting. All currently known species in this part of the galaxy essentially preached the same teaching. Specific terms differed: names, events, religious miracles. But if you discard all the details and reduce everything to a single denominator, which the replicators handled without problems, it turned out that there were not so many differences between the same Drazi and Narns. At least when it came to questions of the spiritual principle, the soul, as an immaterial basis of existence granted by the Creator, was in everyone. Lord Baal, Coron called to me over the network. Captain Sheridan requests a meeting with you. Judging by his outward appearance, he is quite worried and agitated. Tell him that I am ready to receive him at any time. Sheridan? I wonder. It seemed that the captain was noticeably hot. The man was standing in front of my door in half an hour.
just long enough to quickly get to the embassy sector. Sheridan was collected, gloomy and very concerned. Everything, as Corone said. Captain, I'm meeting a guest at the cabin threshold. How can I help you? Judging by your expression, something happened that alarmed you? I apologize for such a sudden visit, Lord Baal, the station commander sighed. But the information I received requires an urgent conversation with you. Really? I tilt my head to the shoulder, thoughtfully, simultaneously inviting the man to come in and sit down. Honestly, I'm having some trouble deciding where and how to begin our conversation. The captain hesitated. But I believe the information is too important to simply ignore.
Even if it seems insignificant to you.
You intrigue me, Captain. I nod. Tea? I think you could use a few minutes of peace and rest. I don't... Oh, although... John waved his hand, sinking into one of the chairs. Tea would be very welcome. I'm listening, I nod amiably, starting to jingle the dishes in the kitchen corner. I know how strange my words may seem, but... Tell me, Lord Baal, Sheridan hesitated, how do you feel about various kinds of predictions, visions of the future? This is a very unexpected question, Captain. I raised my eyebrows in surprise, and even froze for a moment from such an unexpected beginning. Still, please answer. It will help to understand my words better. Well, I nod. Time is quite a complex matter, if I may say so. Within the framework of scientific facts known to me, such a phenomenon as prediction, I move my fingers in the air. Prediction of the future, in the form in which rational people usually understand it, is impossible. Trivially, because the future does not exist until it becomes the present. Please, your tea. But what do the fortune tellers see then? John blinked in confusion, accepting the cup of drink. I would call it one of the possible scenario. I shrug my shoulders. The most probable, but nevertheless still one of. Our conversation is actually thousands and thousands of years old, Captain. Is there predetermination? Does destiny exist? If we assume that there is a predetermined order of events stretching into the infinity of the future, I thoughtfully stroke my beard. We will have to admit that there is also a certain entity that created this order. You are talking about God.
About God, I nod, but not about the one that exists within the framework of any of the religions, but about the real one, about a person, an entity, capable of embracing the entire universe with its attention. Do you think its existence is impossible? Sheridan carefully took a sip of tea, closing his eyes blissfully for a moment. If you meet him in person, I smile. Please tell me. And what about visions of the past? The captain frowned, thinking about something intensely. What about them? I shrug. Past events have already happened, and any event that has happened leaves a trace in space. Most often, this trace cannot be seen with the eyes, but sometimes it happens the other way around. It's a question of the efforts made, I smile, and available technologies. And now, Captain Sheridan, I sit down opposite the man, picking up a second cup of tea. Tell me what you came with. Sheridan's face showed serious thought. It seemed that the topic he had brought up for conversation was quite weighty and important, both for the captain himself and for me. At least, that's what he thought. I wonder, what could have excited me so? I don't know if I should tell you about this at all, the captain began slowly, from the point of view of the charter and laws, but I will still pass on the information to you. Sheridan carefully took the information crystal out of his pocket, placing it base on the table in front of him. I have no right to reveal the source of the information, but I can only say that I trust it to some extent. This crystal contains, he sighed, a vision of the future, one of its variants, if we follow your explanations. Now it was time for me to look at my interlocutor and the information carrier on the table in bewilderment. A vision of the future, a prediction. The replicators were able to calculate the future, to predict the outcome of a given situation based on knowledge of statistics and data about the surrounding space. But even for them, 99% was the limit of reasonable accuracy, above which the probability was not taken into account,
being considered unreliable due to lack of data. Of course, this only concerned conditionally random events. But still, even for the event of a brick falling in a gravity field, there were their own nuances. And again, this is somewhat unexpected news, Captain. I look closely at the man. No less than for me, Lord Baal. However, I suggest you watch the recording yourself and decide whether you should believe what you see. Perhaps you are right, I nod, carefully taking the crystal in my fingers and rising to my feet. Enjoy your tea, Captain. I'll just be a minute. A vision of the future. Well, let's see what it has in store for us. While still walking to the terminal, I carefully scanned the data crystal in my hand. Material, shape, internal structure. It was completely identical to the typical information carriers used in this galaxy. In general, crystals as data storage were common to all species, differing only in material, manufacturing method, and quality, and, to some extent, data encryption and compression methods. However, this concerned more the devices for reading them than the carriers themselves. In this case, the crystal in my hand exactly matched those used by the Earth Commonwealth. Curious. "This is impossible," came a message from Corone as soon as I inserted the crystal into the terminal's reader and started recording. And I was probably inclined to agree with the Neki's opinion, at least on this issue. The storage medium contained a short 44.15-second recording showing my planet.
The very planet on which the laboratory complex was located and which, in fact, was the very outpost of the Goa'uld Empire. The recording metadata contains service tags used by the Great Machine interface, the girl noted. "Yes, Sheridan, you were definitely right. It was worth seeing." The recording contained footage of the shadow ships attacking the planet. But it wasn't even the fact of such an event that was questionable. After all, the ancients were a sufficiently advanced species to be able to travel such a long distance and confident enough in their power to dare to undertake such an action at all. The recording ended at the most interesting part. But that was the least of the problems. What interested me much more was how the Great Machine was able to create such a recording at all. There was no indication in the data collected by the replicators of the existence of such systems inside the device.
Or, what was equally puzzling, was some undocumented function of the machine activated under certain circumstances, as was the case with the Stargate, which turned out to be capable of transferring objects in time if the transition channel crossed an ejection of stellar matter of certain parameters. "Thank you for the information, Captain." I returned to the man with a pensive expression on my face, drinking tea. "This information is definitely worth considering." "I hope this helps you." Sheridan nodded. The man's face clearly showed deep thoughtfulness. The captain was trying to assess the potential impact of my information on all of his, Delen's, and Kosh's plans, which was reasonable and obvious. I was more interested in another point. If such a move as direct aggression towards an interfering factor, albeit with a stretch, fit into their behavioral paradigm on the part of our secretive neighbors, then the Vorlon's reaction to my presence was somewhat difficult to predict.
The Kosh kindred, despite their dominant position in the galaxy after the last encounter with the Shadows, were much more cautious and carefully weighed their actions. But they could not fail to react at all. Should I expect another visit from the ambassador? No, there is no point in this at the moment. We already discussed everything during the previous meeting, and I did not take any active actions affecting the interests of the forces of light. Direct aggression. The replicator network gave only 14.587% for such an outcome, as opposed to 87.457% for the Shadows. But they will definitely do something funny. The only question is, what exactly? I will contact my government. I break the prolonged silence. At the moment, I do not see any reason for a preemptive strike against the enemy, especially based on just one unconfirmed vision. But in any case, it is worth preparing for a probable event.
Well, John finished his tea. I'll be glad if this recording is useful to you, Lord Baal. Perhaps I'll go, well, there's a lull in Babylon. There's a rare chance to sleep a couple of hours longer than usual. Good evening, Captain. I nod, smiling amiably. The man left, and I was still sitting on the couch, scrolling the recording from the crystal before my eyes. A completely useless prediction. There was not a single indication of a point in time in the image. The Shadows could equally well fly to visit me tomorrow, in an hour, or in a couple of 100 years. Of course, it was possible to determine the time by the mutual arrangement of stars in a visible part of the galaxy. But this method did not work until we started talking about thousands and millions of years of difference, so, as I already told Commander Sinclair, if someone wants to declare war on me, I will listen to him with pleasure. And I will answer in a completely symmetrical manner.
It would be wise to launch a preemptive strike. Corona transmitted. The coordinates of the mother world of shadows are in the Great Machine's databases. Direct aggression will be an extreme measure. I convey the image of a negative headshake. It's unreasonable, Niek aside. But it's easier to put up with you than to rewrite. Interlude. A tall, thin humanoid with pale skin and strange golden eyes stood in a state of extreme thought, looking somewhere upward. And he did not care at all that before his eyes were many kilometers of rock and a complex multi-level city. Lorien. At least, that is what they called it for the last thousands of years. Once he had another name, a real one. But in the eons that had passed since then, the universe and he himself had managed to forget not only its sound, but also the language in which it could be spoken.
Even the appearance of the wise old man was just a mask, a familiar appearance that allowed him to communicate with younger species without causing unnecessary problems. Lorien was old, very old. His golden eyes had seen so much, and his memory had stored so much, that sometimes he himself had difficulty determining the order in which certain events had occurred. However, for representatives of his biological species, time and age were very relative concepts. In the rare moments when he managed to exchange a few words with other intelligent beings who were able to understand his speech, he usually said, telling about himself, that in his time, at the dawn of the universe, everyone was immortal. A strange, amazing whim of the universe that gave birth to the first living beings. The thickness of the stone and the distances in space were no insurmountable obstacle for his sight, and what he saw he did not like at all. Shadows, his old protégés, who had appeared in the galaxy many thousands of years ago, were already an aggressive and uncompromising species, but what he saw now? Even from here, from the very depths of Zadum, the first one saw and felt the blazing, aggressive nature of the inhabitants of the planet above him. But he also saw the cold, calculated calculations of their opponents, the Vorlons, the adherents of order and stability, who put orderly development and control above all else. The pupils, like the disobedient grandchildren that the youngest races usually have, argued for many centuries about whose view of the world was correct and whose would only lead to failure and disappointment, and each turn of their dispute shook the galaxy, leading to the destruction and fall of many races and cultures. Lorien did not remember the last time he had seen the younger races that had gone through the entire path of development.
And this was depressing, even though he had promised himself not to interfere in what was happening. Lorien frowned. The ancient being's eyes filled with golden light, and he concentrated. Sparks of life from younger races were scattered across the galaxy, differing in the intensity, the density of their radiance. The elder races left a more noticeable mark on the universe, the younger less. But the most noticeable were the primordial races, the old ones, the ones Lorien knew better than the others. A dark, swirling cloud pierced by many eyes burning with sparks of flame, enveloping the planet above and several systems in the far corners of the galaxy. Shadows, a bright white torch shining in the darkness like a beacon, the Vorlons. And a third force? Lorien's eyes slid across the galaxy, and everywhere he saw such a strange trace, unlike anything else. Threads shining with molten gold, spreading between the stars and intertwining into several dense and extremely bright balls. How could he have missed the appearance of someone so notable? The first one shook his head sadly. He had been sitting in solitude for too long, tired of the burden of being a teacher and tutor. Perhaps he should have gone beyond the boundary, like many of his descendants. Perhaps he would do so soon, but for now, something told Lorien that very soon he would have to make a difficult decision. Sheridan walked slowly down the corridor, replaying the conversation that had taken place in Lord Baal's cabin in his head, and wondering how this whole situation could turn out. Lately, it had begun to seem to him that the universe was stubbornly rolling into a deep, stinking pit, and everyone around him seemed to have made it their goal to confirm his suspicions.
Shadows, the great enemy, apocalyptic predictions,
ancient races that had lived for millions of years. John felt like he was in some strange 20th century science fiction series, but he couldn't figure out if he was watching a black comedy or a low-grade thriller. And now his deputy, Commander Ivanova, had added pleasure after her flight to the planet below. Sighing, the man inserted the identification card into the reader and stepped into the open door of his cabin. The recording of President Clark's conversation with the unknown man, during which they discussed the assassination attempt on his predecessor, was burning the captain's jacket pocket to his own regret. He was well aware of what a mountain of manure this small crystal could turn into. It remained only to hope that General Haig would be able to use this information, somehow leveling out the possible side effects. Otherwise,
Shaking his head, dispersing sad thoughts, the captain sat down at the table with the terminal. Contacting the general directly meant setting both him and himself up, but for just such a case, John had a special communication channel left for him by Haig in their previous conversation. Having gone online, Sheridan went to the Cheap Ads portal, created an anonymous account, and having drafted a short text, posted an ad with a life period of 1 day, leaving the fake mailbox registered to some random trader from one of the Earth colonies as a feedback. Now all that was left was to wait for the ad to be responded to and act in accordance with the instructions. It was extremely stupid and strange to feel like some kind of spy from a pulp novel, but this was one of the few relatively safe ways to anonymously contact certain people from the general staff. Having made sure that the announcement had been successfully placed, John thoughtfully tapped his fingers on the tabletop, thinking about the situation. It was important to inform the command about the information obtained, but in light of the upcoming problems, he had another very pressing problem, and it was no longer possible to postpone its solution. Lieutenant Prendick. John touched a couple of buttons and called his first officer. "Good evening, sir." Edward's slightly surprised face appeared on the display. "How can I help you?" "I apologize for calling so late. Would it be too much trouble for you to come to my cabin? I have something important to discuss." "Sir?" Prendick raised his eyebrows. "Of course, sir. I'll be right there." "Thank you," the captain nodded, hanging up. Deep inside, he still had some doubts about the correctness of his decision. But even when he was captain of the Agamemnon, he had clearly decided and strictly followed the principle of honesty with his subordinates. Of course, this did not apply to everything in a row. The minimum sufficient information of the performers was not invented by him and far from yesterday. But in the case of the senior common staff, to which he included his deputy on board the Calvados, honesty and openness in the maximum possible form almost always turned out to be the key to success and efficiency of work. Besides, during the time that had passed, he had managed to familiarize himself in detail with both Prendick's personal file and the non-statutory information about his service, starting with the Naval Academy, received from the same General Haig.
And what Sheridan had learned looked very promising. The lieutenant had achieved everything on his own, had not been noticed in violations of the charter and rules, but at the same time had a reliable moral compass, largely coinciding with his own. Well, and, besides, the general approved of John's idea of involving the senior assistant in their small club of conspirators. "Captain Sheridan," came the call from the front door. "Yes, come in, Lieutenant." John let the first mate in. "Once again, I apologize for the late call. You were probably already planning to rest." "It's nothing, Captain." Edward smiled, waving his hand. "You don't burden the Calvados crew with too many tasks as it is, and keeping the ship in combat readiness doesn't take much effort." "Okay," Sheridan nodded, gesturing for the lieutenant to sit in the chair. "First of all, I must say that no matter how our conversation goes, you are free to leave the cabin at any time and go about your business." Ahem. An intriguing start. Captain Prendick glanced at the commander with interest. "I'm all ears." As you know, John began slowly almost a year ago. There was an attempt to assassinate President Santiago, a successful. At that moment, I was just finishing up selecting the crew for the Calvados. The lieutenant nodded, so I wasn't particularly interested in the news, but yes, it would have been difficult to miss something like that. "What would you say," the captain looked intently at his subordinate, "if you found out that the traces of this assassination attempt go to the very top of the presidential administration, the current president?" It was something. When the captain sent her to follow the first ones on the ship that Ambassador Delenn promised to provide, Ivanova could never have imagined what kind of ship it would be. Delenn, who was clearly expecting her, nodded to the woman and said that she would be happy to keep her company. "I need to..." That alone was unusual, but Susan found the strength to simply nod in response.
and silently follow the Minbari woman in the direction of the dock allocated for the delegation. Clearance for departure, confirmed by Ivanova over the communicator from the same ship, a short flight in hyperspace, and this. Incredible. Commander Ivanova breathed out, moving her gaze from a contentedly smiling Delenn to the view screen. How beautiful. Is this your ship, Ambassador? This is the White Star, Commander Ivanova, Delenn nodded, one of the first ships of the new generation, and the first ray of hope in the coming war with the darkness. Susan shook her head, fascinated, as she gazed at the shimmering hull of the ship in the darkness of space. The White Star, as Delenn had called it, was a small, graceful vessel, not at all like the Minbari ships Ivanova had seen many times.
It was hard to accurately judge the size of the vessel, especially from here in the cabin of the embassy shuttle. But even so, it seems to her that the star was much smaller than she would have thought. "It doesn't look like the Minbari ships I've seen before," Ivanova said thoughtfully, looking around at the walls of the hangar floating past. "As I said, this is the newest Minbari warship, Commander. It's small in tonnage, but its technical specifications are superior to anything we've had before. It's a combination of Minbari and Volon technology. Prototype." "Yes and no," the ambassador shrugged. "Of course, this is a new ship, new technologies, but still, I would not dare to offer you such a risky flight on a prototype. This is the first serial model. Please, Commander, I will show you everything." Delenn rose from the pilot's seat and motioned for Ivanova to follow her. Ship's interior was as aesthetically pleasing as it had been from space. Curved corridors, calm, subdued lighting. If she hadn't known where she was, Susan would have been willing to bet that this wasn't a ship but a Minbari temple. "Honestly, I find it difficult to classify the ship into any specific class." Ivanova spread her hands. "As far as I understand Earth's terminology." The ambassador thought for a moment. "The White Star refers to heavy assault corvettes, although, of course, we look at this issue somewhat differently." "I understand." "Welcome to the bridge." Another turn revealed double doors that slid smoothly apart as the women approached. "Normally, Minbari ships are staffed by members of the warrior caste, but..." Delenn winced. "We have some misunderstandings right now, so we had to recruit a crew of their priests. They also helped build it." "Ambassador Delenn, welcome aboard. Commander Ivanova, I presume?" A smiling man dressed in clothes vaguely familiar to Ivanova approached them from one of the consoles. "True. And you—"
"Let me introduce,"
the Minbari nodded. "This is Marcus. He is one of the Minbari Rangers. I told you about him at our meeting."
Yes, I remember.
Ivanova nodded. "Nice to meet you, Marcus."
"Likewise. I thought Captain Sheridan would join this flight, after all." "It's not that important, Marcus." Delenn shook her head. "Besides, Commander Ivanova was the one working with the Great Machine. It will be easier for her to get her bearings when we arrive in the right system." "Sorry?" "It was originally supposed," the woman sighed after a short silence, turning to Susan, "that this ship would come under the direct command of Captain Sheridan. It would be, a sign of our intentions and mutual trust."
But this can be done later. The main thing now is not to miss the first. Otherwise, she waved her hand. All these intentions will not matter. "This is unexpected news." "Don't worry," Delenn carefully touched the commander's hand. "I'll talk to the captain about this anyway. No one is going to set up anything behind his back." "So," Marcus rubbed his palms when the silence on the bridge dragged on. "We await your command." The man bowed to Delenn. "Not mine, Marcus," the ambassador smiled. "Commander Ivanova, where are we flying first? Just tell me, and Marcus or I will translate it to the crew. Unfortunately, they don't know your language." "Yes." The commander shook her head, collecting her thoughts and putting all doubts aside for later. "Let them set a course for Sigma 957. We'll start from there."
"Of course, Commander." Marcus smiled, turning to one of the Minbari who was patiently awaiting instructions at the nearest console, and spoke a short phrase in Minbari. The priest caste member bowed and wiggled his fingers, entering the system's coordinates into the navigation system. The stars visible through the wide observation window at the end of the cockpit shifted, marking the start of the flight. Chapter 58. The Collective Unconscious. Every action has consequences.
Stieg Larsson. Over and over again, the replicators continued to play the recording of Sheridan's prediction of the shadows attacking my planet, sifting through it frame by frame in search of the smallest clues and details that might have been missed during a simple viewing. However, this was of little use, since I still had no particular idea of the time of this event, and it was impossible to say anything definite from the external features of the colony.
Moreover, the very fact of the possibility of seeing the future made the replicators scratch their missing heads with their manipulators in confusion. All the information available in the database only said what I had already told Captain Sheridan. If we accept that there is a single and predetermined timeline, we have to admit that there is some higher being capable of ensuring this predestination. However, there was a more probable, although no less absurd, option. The complex did not see the future, but looked into one of the alternative dimensions of reality, in which time was shifted forward relative to the space in which the machine was located. Then the local cosmic metaphysics came into play once again, when the great machine somehow determined, based on the parameters of the operator's consciousness, which of the infinite number of versions of reality was most, likely to happen at a given moment in relation to this particular great machine.
And yes, from the realization that somewhere out there, in the depths of space, there were millions of copies of myself, I experienced an almost real tickling somewhere inside. The only thing worse was the realization that in each version, there were probably costs. Many costs. Millions and billions of costs. I hope I will never have to see this with my own eyes. Lord Baal. Alice, who had looked into the cabin, raised her eyebrows in surprise, noticing my frowning face. Is everything all right? Yes, I nod my head. Everything is fine. Did you want something? Yes. The girl hesitated slightly. Tell me, Lord Baal, can I stay on 005? I mean, I understand that your patronage solves my problem with the Psychor, but Brother Theo offered me to help them. I still have time before the start of my studies, so, if possible. The obvious embarrassment on the telepath's face made me want to smile paternally. However, I didn't see anything criminal in her question, even if someone from the COP had arrived at the station. Her presence at the station would not have affected her status as a political refugee on my territory. Moreover, since the entire Babylon 5 was a diplomatic, neutral territory, I think that even such an impudent organization as the one to which our old friend Bester belonged would think 3 times before taking particularly decisive steps towards the girl. If Brother Theo doesn't mind your company, I smile anyway, then of course you can stay on the station. And the issue of diplomatic asylum is easily resolved on the territory of Babylon. After all, my cabin is also legally the territory of the Goa'uld Empire. Thank you, the girl beamed. If you need anything, just ask. I think Commander Ivanova wouldn't mind giving you a cabin for the duration of your stay here. Of course, Lord Baal, the telepath nodded. I'll run? Go, Alice, go, I nod.
Well, getting back to our sheep, the issue of a potential courtesy visit from the shadows was still worth resolving. As I told Corona earlier, a preemptive strike, although possible, was not the most correct decision from my point of view, and the main argument was the indisputable fact that the vision of the future of the great machine could not be considered a guaranteed future, and therefore, as in any prophecy, the best solution to the problem would be inaction, or rather, following the previously chosen path, so as not to lead with your own actions to the very outcome that you intended to avoid. Of course, there was always the option of catching Mr. Morden, who had been flashing in the station's camera field of view with enviable consistency until now, setting up numerous meetings and obviously carrying out some business that only he understood.
Catch him and ingratiatingly hint to his employers that before each escalation of the conflict it was worth thinking 3 times about the results of this process and the consequences to which it could lead. And then, in exactly the same way, extremely politely, one could pay a courtesy visit to Ambassador Kosh, inquiring even more ingratiatingly how the noble dons would react to a completely adequate and, I assure you, quite symmetrical reaction to the direct aggression of their colleagues. In the sandbox, despite all their ideological contradictions and ostentatious hatred for each other, for some reason it seems to me that each act of the space opera, which has been going on for more than 1,000 years, was directed by very joint efforts. And the replicator network gave a significant 62.133% of such an outcome, although there was not enough initial data for a more complete analysis.
And both options looked both reasonable and dangerous in terms of pushing events, which again brought me back to the best choice of passively waiting for the outcome of the situation. But this does not mean that I will simply wave my hand at the information I've received. That is why, right now, all existing replicator objects on my territory are switching to a mode of constant and thorough scanning of the surrounding space, and in the system where the laboratory complex is located, a number of defensive structures are being assembled from replicator blocks designed to protect the planet from an attack from orbit, and a certain number of huttaks for confrontation in space. The probability that the shadows will demonstrate something especially unpleasant and unpredictable was 18.398%, which was a small value to panic, but definitely a sufficient value to remain on guard, no matter how paranoid it might look. Interlude. Did you see the news, Captain?
A gloomy Ivanova appeared on the threshold of Sheridan's office, leaning her shoulder against the doorframe.
Who hasn't seen it? John sighed, gesturing for the commander to sit down. It's a good thing your recording from the Great Machine hasn't surfaced yet. I thought you passed it on to the right place. Of course I did, nodded the man, who had indeed already managed to send the information crystal in accordance with the instructions he had received from Hague. But such things are not done in a hurry. Besides, he sighed again, if the information had surfaced right now, against the backdrop of this recording, Sheridan did not finish, simply waving his hand. And it was quite possible. Why not every day you can hear in the interstellar news that a new, previously unknown alien race that may pose a threat to planetary security was discovered, to counter which extraordinary measures will be needed.
These words might not mean anything to ordinary people. But everyone who had at least some relation to the vertical command of the Ministry of Defense understood perfectly well that such a simple formulation could mean everything from raising taxes to introducing martial law in all territories of the Earth Commonwealth. It could still lead to increased tensions. Captain, this is Garibaldi. The voice of the head of security came from the communicator. Yes, Michael. Sheridan raised his hand to his mouth. What happened? Code 7B. In half an hour in the third conference room, the man said briefly. Got it, John replied, exchanging glances with Ivanova and hanging up. Code 7B was a code phrase invented to indicate the need to gather for everyone who was aware of the shadows, and everything connected with them. If Michael declared the need to urgently meet in such an ultimatum form, it meant that he had dug up something serious.
The captain's face literally read the thought, well, what else? But he had to go in any case. Nodding to Susan, who was clearly thinking about something similar, Sheridan rose from his chair, straightening his jacket. Half an hour was more than enough to walk from his office to the necessary hall, but too little to do anything else. He could head there right away. It seemed that many people thought the same. By the time Sheridan and Ivanova arrived, Dr. Franklin was already sitting at the table in the conference room, and literally, a few minutes later, Ambassador Delenn and Lanier came up. The only one missing was Garibaldi, who came up as promised half an hour later, leading the already familiar Ranger Marcus and an unfamiliar young woman who looked extremely exhausted and tired. Thank you all for coming, Michael began from the doorway. Forgive me for such an unexpected meeting, but the question is important. 7 years ago, back on Mars, I saw one thing, but I could not prove it. Neither my superiors at the time, nor anyone else believed me. They considered me crazy. Therefore, I decided to remain silent. Silent until I find something that can prove my words. That day has come. He turned to the woman brought in. This is Dr. Mary Kirkish, an archaeologist whom Marcus found at my request and helped get here. Please hear her out. For the last 12 years, after a pause, the woman looked around at those present with a wary gaze and began to tell. I have worked in interplanetary expeditions. As a xenoarchaeologist, we conduct excavations on other worlds in search of new technologies. Kirkish hesitated, adding, For us new, study the past for the sake of the future? Franklin nodded. I remember. 7 years ago I worked on Mars, continued Mary. We were looking for artifacts that we thought should have been buried under the Martian soil thousands of years ago. And it was all in vain, not a shard. Not a piece of metal. But one day our sensors found something under the rock, deep down, an artificial object. Given the depth of its occurrence, should have been there for 1,000 years. It was not easy to dig it out, even halfway. It took us almost a week, but it was enough to turn my whole life into a nightmare. Dr. Kirkish fell silent, her eyes closed, and her jaw muscles began to twitch as she recalled what she had seen in those days. It was clearly difficult and extremely unpleasant for her. Delenn, who was sitting next to him, showed genuine sympathy on her face, and she touched the archaeologist's hand with her fingers, expressing support.
After a few seconds of silence, Mary shook herself, nodding gratefully to those present for their patience, and continued. It was exactly the same ship that was shown on the news today, only 1,000 years older, and in our home. An oppressive silence fell over the room. A shadow ship on Mars, practically in the Commonwealth's backyard. And it had been there all this time, and no one had even suspected it? The officers on the station clearly recognized the scale of the potential problems that Kirkish's story would cause, and Sheridan couldn't help but think that many recent events now looked completely different, frighteningly different. But on Earth they say that no one has seen such ships, John said. They are lying. I saw him with my own eyes. The woman shook her head. Then why all the fuss? Franklin shrugged, exchanging glances with Garibaldi. A reason to increase security? Ivanova suggested. Limited information. The captain nodded.
That means, Delenn said with a straight face, that they don't care at all what these ships are. They were finding out who else knows about them. But, Ambassador, a gloomy Franklin shook his head. We don't have enough data for such serious and far-reaching conclusions. There was only one ship there. There was only one, right? The oppressive silence, during which everyone involuntarily looked at Dr. Kirkish, who had lowered her head, became the most eloquent answer to the doctor's question. That was just the beginning. She shook her head. Only a few people knew about what happened, including me. They either died or disappeared, without a trace. I suppose a complex mixture of resignation and doom appeared on Kirkish's face. When I leave Babylon 5, I too will disappear. But it doesn't matter. I'll have time to tell you. Someone has to stop this horror.
We reported our discovery to Earth. We were happy to finally find traces of alien life on the seemingly deserted Mars. But then everything went wrong. One of the workers, busy cleaning the found ship from soil, accidentally touched it with his bare hand. He died on the spot. Did you get a response from Earth? Sheridan asked. The death of a worker at an excavation site. You probably reported it immediately. Of course, the woman nodded. But they didn't answer us right away. A week later, we were ordered to stop work and the entire staff was transferred to a backup base 2 miles from the excavation site. For those who didn't want to, they prepared an excellent motivation with inevitable dismissal. We sat at this base for 6 days without any news. We just waited. And shuttle after shuttle kept flying to the pit with the ship, until suddenly, Mary sobbed, reliving what she had seen. Exactly the same ship, only clean, black like the night itself, and flying above the surface of the planet. I wanted to hide somewhere. Even just bury myself in the ground. But there was nowhere to run. And I watched. At first I thought he wanted to destroy the second ship. But then I realized he was digging it out. I was digging, Lenier said quietly. It was quiet for a while, Mary nodded. The ship went down into the excavation, out of sight. And then, I will never forget that scream for the rest of my days. The sound, like it was tearing your brain apart from the inside. A piercing scream, penetrating to the bone. The ships flew away, and then a message came from the corporation's management that if we tell anyone what we saw, we will be in big trouble. I never saw anyone from my group again.
Michael? John turned questioningly to Kirkesh Garibaldi, who was clearly about to add to what he had said. Around the same time, I was flying to Mars with a pilot.
To a malfunction, we had to walk for some time, get to one of the cities. And it seems I saw some of what she was talking about. Only when I went back there to make sure, it was already empty. Nothing but rocks and sand. Nothing but... Michael put his hand in his pants pocket, meaningfully placing a small object in the middle of the table. A charred, rusted and melted Greek letter, Psi badge. Psychor. Ivanova threw up her hands. Psychor are everywhere. That's not the worst part, Captain, Garibaldi sighed suggestively, nodding towards Kirkish. A few weeks ago I was called to an excavation. They found another ship, on Ganymede. And now everything is much worse. How much worse could it get? Susan sighed. Sorry, Dr. Kirkish, please continue. Yes, the woman nodded. Now it's worse. Now they're going to transport this thing to Earth. I don't know whose decision it was, but the ship will be carefully studied in order to later
Use the new technologies for wars, to build new ships. We can't leave it in their hands. It will be used for anything, but not for fighting these shadows. It will be a weapon of intimidation, a way to turn us into the same as them. But, however, that's all. Kirkish exhaled, drooping her shoulders. That's all I wanted to tell you. Now let them do whatever they want with me, as with the others. That won't happen. Mary Dellen smiled warmly. We'll hide you with the Minbari. You'll be safe there. Lanier, she turned to her assistant. Take care of Dr. Kirkish. Stay with her for now. Make sure everything goes well. Of course, the Minbari nodded, rising from the table. Let's go, Doctor. And don't worry about anything. Under the silent and sympathetic gazes of those present, Lanier and the archaeologist left the conference room. The news voiced by the woman was disturbing. All participants in this little conspiracy against the forces of darkness understood perfectly well that nothing good would come out of Earth's undertaking. Even if someone managed to transport one ship to a secret laboratory, its real owners would soon find out about it. And even if there were no consequences for humanity, even with the most successful study and research, it was unlikely that even one of those present doubted that all this would not end well. If Earth and Psychor really have allied with the shadows, Franklin said slowly, that's bad, really bad. I doubt we all understand how much, Sheridan muttered, pointedly examining his fingernails. One thing is clear, each of you knows what the Earth is turning into. John glanced at the station officers. And if President Clark gets such a ship, such technology, Ivanova shook her head, it will be the end of everything we can count on at home. Garibaldi finished. We must destroy this ship before it leaves the excavations on Ganymede. And how do you plan to do this, Captain?
Mike raised an eyebrow skeptically, leaving out all the technical details like flying from here to the solar system. Calvados has fought such a ship once before, John said, with grim determination in his voice. The first mate fully agreed with my arguments about Clark and the death of President Santiago. But the Calvados is an Earth prototype ship. Ivanova shook her head in shock. If they see it near Ganymede, if they detect it, to hell with it. There's no guarantee it'll make it. I saw the damage records from the station's repair dock. Your ship was lucky, and it won't be that lucky again. But Susan turned to the Minbari ambassador with a look of enlightenment on her face. Ambassador Delen, your ship, the one we used to search for the primordials. A ship? Sheridan asked, puzzled.
Yes, John? The Minbari nodded slowly, smiling at the corners of her lips. White Star. We were going to hand it over to you back then, on the first sortie. But you were busy, and Commander Ivanova flew. This is an incredible ship, Captain. And most importantly, it was built by the Minbari, but with Volan technology. Deland finished for the woman. If it's spotted near your planets, no one will be able to identify the vessel. It will have the element of surprise, even for combat with a shadow ship. I hope everyone in this room understands, Garibaldi drawled, with a demonstratively bored look, that as soon as you exit hyperspace, our ships will immediately detect you and shoot you down as aliens. You won't shoot at your own, will you? Of course not, Sheridan shook his head. And if you are captured, Garibaldi continued. I can imagine the newspaper headlines. Captain of Babylon 5, celebrated hero of the Earth Minbari War, turns out to be a traitor. We'll try to make sure they don't capture us. In a case, the captain gritted his teeth. This is my decision to make, and I won't shift responsibility for the consequences to any of you. Delenn, can we really use your white star? Yes, Captain, the Minbari nodded. I'll let the crew know the ship will be near Babylon 5 very soon. In that case, Captain! No, Commander. Sheridan stopped the woman with a sharp gesture. This is an order. As everyone here understands, I cannot go on this mission as a captain of the Earth Commonwealth. That is why I will fly as a private citizen, leaving my uniform and insignia in my cabin. Officially, the man paused, choosing his words. I am still on the station. Ivanova, he looked at his deputy. Try to make sure my absence is not noticed. How long will it take us to get home?
I think 2 days one way, Captain. Delenn estimated the distance in her mind. So 5 days with the reserve? Michael? He turned to the head of security. While I'm gone, you and Ivanova are in command of both the station and the Rangers. In case everything goes completely wrong, the captain sighed grimly. I'll leave instructions for you and Lieutenant Prendick on my terminal in the cabin. Review them in 5 days, but in general terms write it off as an accident doing training flights in a fighter. He shrugged. I think Dr. Franklin wouldn't mind providing some organics for the remains. It seems, Stephen replied no less gloomily, that you have long been anticipating something like this?
It's too well thought out a plan for pure improvisation. It was only a matter of time before we had to do something like this, going, Sheridan grimaced, against the charter and the law. So you're right. I'm just adjusting plans to a specific situation, although it doesn't make it any easier for me. Ivanova, who had started to say something, cut herself off at the very beginning, shaking her head, and then nodded clearly in a military manner. We will do everything, Captain. The main thing, don't do anything stupid. All the stupid stuff has already been done for me, John sighed. To work, gentlemen. Delenn, he turned to the ambassador. I will still have time to get acquainted with your ship while we are flying, but tell me at least in a few words. Certainly, the Minbari bowed to everyone present, then headed towards the exit. Sheridan sighed and followed. The last few days had been wonderfully rich in surprises. But God knows, John would have given a lot for the dull and boring routine to be going on around him. The captain sometimes thought that he should have refused the assignment to Babylon 5. Yes, you can't really argue with a direct order from the president, but you could always resign, right? Susan Ivanova was not pleased. And that was an understatement to describe the depth of her feelings about the situation they were all in. The captain had once again taken everything he could take and set out on what she was almost certain was a suicide mission. Yes, the Minbari ship Delenn had was superior from what she had seen, superior to any Earth Alliance vessel. She had some thoughts about the Calvados, but otherwise… Commander Ivanova? What do you want, Marcus? Susan answered with a heavy sigh. Marcus. Another pain in the ass. Hell, she had no idea who he even was.
Sure, he was human, clearly a citizen, or had been a citizen of the Commonwealth. Sure, he was one of the Rangers, a religious military organization run by the Minbari to fight the shadows. But why was he on Babylon 5, walking around acting like he had to? And no one seemed to care that he was, in fact, a civilian. And that wasn't even mentioning security clearances and inside information. New information has come from our intelligence outposts. He checked the small tablet in his hands. So far, everything is still quiet. After that, failure at Narn. The Centauri are clearly afraid to make any particularly abrupt movements. Although they are definitely amassing a fleet near their borders, perhaps they are afraid of a retaliatory strike from the enemy. Uh-huh. Ivanova nodded absently, still remaining thoughtful. It's hard to say. The ranger narrowed his eyes slightly, noticing the woman's behavior.
Perhaps, he smiled slyly while maintaining completely serious tone of voice, they know something that we don't? For example, that a dragon will soon appear, one of those that eats a sun every 30 days. It's vile, of course, but what can you expect from a giant space lizard? But it's better than 15 wild badgers in my pens. Yeah, badgers are definitely worse than dragons. The commander closed the terminal in irritation. What badgers? What dragon? What kind of nonsense are you even talking about? Damn it, I have no idea who you are or why you're hanging around the station. What's your status? Rank? Clearance level? For some reason everyone… There is none, Marcus interrupted her, shrugging his shoulders. I'm a ranger, but that doesn't matter to anyone except me or the Mirbarians. But that's clearly not what's bothering you. What's wrong, Commander Ivanova? With your arrival on Babylon 5, everything has gone to hell.
Every time I see you, something happens. And now, just when Garibaldi asked you to find this, Dr. Kirkish, the captain, set off on this suicidal adventure. No one forced Captain Sheridan to do this. He made the decision himself, and we… Of course he decided. It was absolutely obvious that he would decide so. Susan jumped up from the table, stopping right in front of the man's face. It was obvious to me, he answered calmly, that he would send me away. So I don't understand at all why it's my fault. I should have flown with him, or even flown instead of him, damn it. I don't even understand why the hell I'm telling you all this now. Ivanova kicked the visitor's chair next to her desk in anger. A tense silence reigned in the office, and Susan cursed herself for losing her temper. Not only had she lost her composure, but she had also done so in front of a completely unrelated civilian who, by some freak of the universe, had happened to be at hand.
I apologize for my outburst. Taking a deep breath, the woman turned back to Marcus, who was still standing there. Apparently, the very thought that we are forced to do something behind the back of our government, to say the least, drives me crazy. The ranger opened his mouth for a moment, obviously about to say something, but then just bowed his head silently. There wasn't much to say. When you do what needs to be done, you often have to go against your usual notions of what's right. He understood that better than most. Is there anything I can do to help? I don't know. Susan shook her head. I don't know. The black and crimson shimmers of degenerate space could hide a great deal. There are no landmarks, no reference points, no familiar coordinates. Space itself seemed to be doing everything to deliberately confuse and lead astray careless simpletons who decided to use its physical properties for long-distance space travel.
Without beacons and transition zones, flights here were impossible.
Almost an impressive fleet of ships, each of which evoked thoughts of nightmares, broke through space, 24 ships covered in iridescent darkness, skin, ships of an ancient race known in this corner of the galaxy as shadows, and one of them flying at the head, larger than the others, covered in multi-directional black growths. The hull resembled a tight ball of tentacles frozen in a strange dance. On it, as on each of the glossy black hulls, a glowing growth dimly shimmered, looking alien even to them. The journey was long, and the ships needed additional resources. Finally, the lead ship gave a signal, a telepathic impulse cry, barely discernible even to themselves, that rolled through the degenerate space and was received by each of the dark ships. They had arrived. And now the darkness of hyperspace was cut by multiple flashes of opening hyperspace jump funnels. 1, 2, 3. Each of the ships was preparing to jump into normal space. Yes, it was common for them to float, unnoticed from one layer of reality to another, appearing as ghostly apparitions and disappearing into nothingness when the target was destroyed. But here and now it was ineffective. The shadows knew that whoever was waiting for them on the other side was no match for other races, and the stealth attack would bring no advantage, and therefore there was no need to waste their attention on it. A sharp jerk, and the crimson shimmers are replaced by the prickly rays of stars, and ahead is a planet, one of many, a simple stone ball, unburdened by life, if not for the brightly sparkling in the light of the local star even at such a distance. A golden pyramidal structure, towering on one of the rocky plateaus. With another piercing sigh scream, the ships darted to the sides, heading towards the planet at maximum speed, and along the most unpredictable trajectories, and most importantly, the largest vessel froze in the distance. Fighting in space is not his business. He must reach the surface. Break through all the lines of defense, of which the enemy has probably left a great many, and strike at the very heart. And for this he must wait. Catch the right moment. The only one when the enemy is open and unprepared. But they were expected. Any observer would have come to the same conclusion if he had been there. As soon as the black ships approached the planet,
marking the huge spherical station frozen in space as one of the targets of attack. Blue sparks of energy flared brightly in space, swelling into cloud swirls. 1, 2, 3, no, as many as 5 huge ships in the shape of golden pyramids appeared above the planet. 5 attacks against 20 shadows. The shadows froze for a moment, as if completely defying inertia. But the next moment they darted forward to enter the enemy ships, to disrupt the formation.
Each of the ships fired purple beams of energy, 3, 4 for each attack, and
the beams got stuck in the bluish films of the force shields, creating rainbow streaks and waves diverging from the impact sites. Having failed, the shadows went for a second attempt. Now the rays became brighter, and at the same time, the power of the attack's shields definitely increased. They flared up with new rainbow streaks, the waves from which rolled across the entire sphere of the sheltered space, and nothing again. The enemy silently watched, as if studying the attackers and completely ignoring their attempts. A new maneuver and a new attack. This time all the ships chose a single target, concentrating the attack of the beams on one point.
19 purple flashes merge into a single blinding halo, and the shield could not withstand flashing blue. The field disintegrated, leaving behind only a scattering of sparks melting in space and towards a shining golden hull of the ship, although having lost most of their strength, but still, dangerous beams of energy rushed, trying to burn through, melt through, destroy their target. An incredibly bright light flower blossomed on the hull of the Hatak that had lost its shield, generated by multiple reflections and refractions of the shadow attack on the hull elements. For a moment, the already silent space seemed to become even quieter. Even from such a distance, one could see a large hole in the ship's hull. Part of the hull had simply evaporated, having taken the brunt of the blow, but the deeper the beams penetrated, the less damage they managed to inflict. And a moment later, it became clear that this success was much less than it might have seemed at first glance.
the hull surface shuddered, as if crumbling into thousands of scales for a moment, and then froze again, having completely healed the hole and restored its previous appearance. And then the ship responded. From the attacked pyramid, unbearably shining in the darkness of space, a golden drop flew out towards one of the shadows, a concentrated clot of energy hitting the black hole like an asteroid, forcing the ship of shadows to spin in space, losing orientation and fly for some time by inertia, not reacting to what was happening around. Even the appendages that gave the ship the appearance of a spider-like monster seemed to melt from the impact, losing their dark shine and shape. A new salvo struck from the Hatak, finishing off the injured shadow. The ship's hull seemed to shrink inward, crumpling into an untidy lump of darkness, and a dying scream, audible only in the telepathic spectrum, struck space.
The black ships, which had recoiled at first, began to move again, circling the pyramids without stopping, escaping the capture of possible targeting systems. The purple beams, although they did not penetrate the force shields, seemed to weaken them, giving them the opportunity, albeit not with one attack, to reach the hulls of the ships. In any case, even if they were unable to destroy the enemy, they would be able to occupy him long enough to... The black, deep tentacles, silently hanging in space, twitched, coming into motion. Being creatures of collective intelligence, the shadows, like no one else, understood that an individual does not matter. The main thing is the team and the fulfillment of the task. One of the pyramids, reacting to the moving ship, flew forward a little, and a whole line of energy impulses hit the huge shadow. But not one reached the goal. Another black ship, standing in the way of the attack, took on all. Continuing to fire beams at the pyramids, the shadows formed a continuously moving swarm, covering the central ship with their hulls. And this gave an unexpected result. Attack after attack, the Hattaki hit the ships, destroying shadow after shadow, but each time they managed to cover the main target from hits, allowing it to fly further, to the planet. And it flew. Having entered the high orbit of the planetoid, the black ball accelerated sharply for a moment, as if blurring in space, and its appendages began to shine with an unbearably bright purple light, saturated with the glow like the flaring coals of a fire. The ship of shadows fell directly on the central part of the complex of golden buildings located on the planet. A coordinated salvo of pyramid ships hit the back,
But it was too late. An incredible brightest flash of light illuminated the planet, as if a new star had lit up for a moment down there, tiny by cosmic standards, but monstrously furious.
The wave of light which shot out in all directions hit even the hattacks, causing their shields to flicker and the ships themselves to rise to a higher orbit. The remaining ship of the shadows, which did not have time to move aside, simply evaporated under this monstrous attack. The riot of energies below lasted for tens of seconds, but the next moment, when the radiance died down, the ships saw exactly the same planet. A vast golden complex, made up of many pyramidal structures, damaged in some places, having lost their shine, but already healing all the damage. And the metallic shine of the surface, which had previously been hidden under a layer of rock that evaporated during the explosion of the Shadow Fire ship, a surface made up of countless tiny scales, scales along which a ripple, barely noticeable from space, rolled, restoring the smallest damage and returning the general structure to its previous form, repeating the planetary landscape that was here before the attack.
Against the backdrop of the apocalypse that had just occurred, the small hyperspace vortex that had appeared at the very edge of the system would have gone unnoticed. A Vorlon ship emerged from degenerate space, a small transport vessel of the kind usually used for personal needs by individual members of this people. The ship was towing behind it an oddly shaped object, a huge T-shaped structure with many grooves and protrusions. Death, expiration.